My fellow Westorians, I'm Aziz, with me is Ashai, and this is Valar Rereadis. A Dance with Dragons is the longest of the books so far, also the darkest and least understood, thanks to being the most recent. It's the culmination, also so far, of George's style honed over the course of the prior books and the rest of his career. It has the extended length of A Storm of Swords, the expanded pacing of A Feast for Crows, it brings POVs together like A Clash of Kings, and has the setup of A Game of Thrones. If you're watching live, feel free to ask live questions. You can also send questions and comments ahead of time by joining us on one of our social media outlets, like Facebook, Flick, Discord, or Slack. Check out the Isle of Faces podcast. That's Joe Buckley's show. It is in tandem with ours on Valar Rereadis. His notes are also in this and every other Valar Rereadis episode. Also, same goes for Nina Friel, except it's Tumblr and not a podcast. That's Good Queen Alley with one L, highly recommended. She's got writings on a variety of topics, large and small, and all interesting. We have a reorganized main podcast feed. We are in the process of doing some more organization on it, but it should help with binging and watching, or not watching, it's only the podcast feed. We can't change the order of YouTube videos, but it should be a lot nicer for finding certain episodes. Things are next to each other. Part 1s are next to part 2s. All the Blackfire episodes are in a row. Things like that. Something new that we're able to do. We can't do that on Patreon, the Patreon feed. Of course, the Patreon feed has the advantage of a lot more episodes that are not on the main feed. But we do what we can. We were able to reorganize our main feed. And if you have feedback on our feedback, then let us know. Well, that one I didn't plan. But you got to roll with the puns when they pop up, right? Yeah, you got to be ready for them. You never know when they're going to arrive. Daenerys 5 is our first chapter today. Astaporocalypse, a.k.a. the Pale Mare's first ride.
Melisandre, straight out of Asshai, a.k.a. 1,000 Skulls and John.
Reek 3, a peaceful land, a terrified people, a.k.a. My Dinner with Boltons.
And finally, Tyrion 8, the gang meets Moqorro, a.k.a. It's always Doomy in Valyria.
It sure is. If you tend to be a visual person, these chapters may have stood out more so than usual. Perhaps our breakdowns will as well. There are pale things all around us today. The pale mare, Roose and Ramsay's pale eyes, the face of Melisandre. She sees the pale face of Bloodraven in her visions. So many skulls, pale white bone, The frost-covered, pale dead faces of the eyeless rangers are found. Ghost makes an appearance. He's pale white. As with eyes, there's so much red today. Ghost's eyes, right? Of course, there's blood red all over the place, paired with the pale. Bolton eyes of pale, paired with jewelry and heraldry depicting blood. Ramsay's horse is even named Blood. Red and white are blood and bone. And this evokes heart trees. The eyeless rangers who weep blood again come up. They do the same. Even Penny's face looks pale and red-eyed from all the weeping, as Tyrion notes. The red city of Astapor falls, fire sweeping through it, and the bloody flux follows the pale mare to Meereen. Melisandre herself shimmers in red and white, so does Bloodraven, without the shimmering. And what is redder than the fires of the 14 flames, which Tyrion will glimpse today? There is a distinct pattern and theme of doomed or helpless people in large groups. The plight of Astapor is horrific, and with the arrival of the pale mare, the bloody flux will hit Meereen as well, so that's bad. Highly contagious diseases are certainly the sort of thing that can make one feel helpless, especially in medieval-like times like A Song of Ice and Fire, when they have very little idea how such things work. Virus is not a word or concept they're familiar with. It sounds like a mispronunciation of virus. They're like, wait, did you say virus? No, I said virus. Though Theon, or rather through Theon, we learn some of the inner workings of the Dreadfort, how Bolton lords have treated their peasantry for millennia, and it's disturbing. Not surprising, but disturbing. In particular, how helpless they are. What are you supposed to do as a peasant against a Bolton regime? What can you do? Melisandre thinks on how the free folk are a doomed people, while seeing many visions of skulls and thinking of her time in Asshai, a city so huge with a population so tiny, Clearly, the people who once thrived there had their fall as well. Some sort of doom came to Asshai, whether gradual or sudden. Well, that's a topic we try to cover in our Asshai episode. Meanwhile, Tyrion and company sail past the site of the actual doom, where an entire peninsula effectively exploded. A spectacular way to wipe out peoples and cultures all at once. With that, we see how the theme extends to everyone. The doom of Valyria spared neither rich nor poor, and that's similar to how diseases spread without concern over social status. Similar, not identical, certainly. Such a spectacular and chilling sight is appropriately paired with a lot of visions, all of them flame-oriented, pretty much. From Moqorro's visions told to Tyrion to Mel's chapter, which has the most visions since the House of the Undying. Well, probably. I didn't actually count. Like, how do you count them? Like, where does one vision begin and another end? It's not always clear. Anyway, Dany has cause to remember Quaith's visions as the Pale Mare arrives, and we readers wonder about her mention of the perfumed seneschal, aka the stinky steward, in Tyrion's chapter. And we hear that the green grace of Astapor had visions of victory. She was wrong. A vision interpreted wrong is nothing new to us, though. Family is a huge topic today, mostly, though, the lack of it, or the loss of it. Daenerys is an orphan herself, has a motherly relationship with the people under her care. She sort of adopted them. It's somewhat metaphorical, but it fits. Melisandre likely knew her parents for a short time only, if at all. She's basically an orphan. All of our POVs today, only one has a living parent, and that's Theon, and she's lost her mental health almost entirely. That extends to other characters featured as well. For example, Penny. Theon, a character with dad issues, watches Ramsay and Roos's dad/son issues play out right in front of him, and they're also predictably ugly. Just think when you think having no family is bad. Well, you get this example of the Boltons, where you might say, okay, well, it can be worse. No family is better than that family. Which brings us to Tyrion, someone who, as a son of a cruel and callous man, has a lot in common with Ramsay, actually. If Ramsay kills Roose eventually, something he threatens to do for a split second in this chapter, then he'll have even more in common with Tyrion. In stark contrast, conceptually, slavery is a constant enough topic, but it comes up in every chapter today, which means it's coming up more than usual, even more than usual. It's always common, but it's even more today. Melisandre reveals through her first and only POV so far that she was once a slave herself. It certainly seems that way. Sold to the Red Temple at a very young age, it seems. That appears to be the case for Moqorro as well, whom Tyrion meets. Not just him, but the fiery hand with him, his 5 acolytes. All of them are slaves. Theon is effectively a slave to the Boltons. There's a little functional difference there, even if the word slave isn't actually used. Ramsay frequently calls him my Reek, and he means it. He means that I own you. Worse are the implications of how the Dreadfort has oppressed people for countless centuries. We talked about the hiding and the doomed people, but the peasants under Bolton rule could be considered almost slaves. They're not slaves. But the difference is mostly semantics. There are some real differences, but it's not a lot different. And in Dany's chapter, well, what needs to be said? She's already at war with the entire slave trade industry, so let's just go straight there. Daenerys 5, Astaporocalypse, aka the Pale Mare's first ride. This chapter is about turning the screws on Daenerys, making her situation seem very dire, so that when she makes the decision to marry Hisdar, it's, in the last line of the chapter, we feel it. It's a culmination of agonizing over the situation for several chapters, considering her options, trying different things, realizing her mistakes, restating her priority, which is to protect as many innocents as she can. But she's come to terms with the fact that she can't save them all, which is something she kind of stubbornly wanted to do. Appreciate the attitude, but it's not realistic, is it? And that leads to the decision that Hisdar is an acceptable compromise after all. She comes around to the fact that compromise is necessary. She didn't really want to compromise in the first place, but it's become clear that she's going to have to. She didn't set off, after all, to free the slaves and then expect to have to compromise with the people she came to destroy. That was never part of the original plan. She didn't conceive it that way, but that is the reality she faces now. And she does remain enormously powerful despite these setbacks and despite these problems. The passage of time is giving her wisdom and experience, which is one of the few things she lacks, right? She's just got so much else going on for her. Another fine opening sentence starts us off here.
Each morning, from her western ramparts, the queen would count the sails on Slaver's Bay.
It kind of suggests this has been happening for a while, right? By saying each morning, the counting of sails, it's like some sort of ritual anxiety. But Dany usually chooses to face things head on. She doesn't like to hide from problems. And that probably does take its toll, though, on your mental health. There's this note of Myrni's ships being out there, too. It's not just ships from, Yunkai or what have you. And those are ones that escaped when she took the city. So there's this, as Joe calls it, the well-trodden element of old mistakes coming back to bite. And that happens a lot in this book because she's having to do a lot of things that no one knows how to do, and thus mistakes are inevitable and unpredictable elements as well. Karth, Talos, New Gis, they're all out there joining against her. Grolio's advice to Daenerys is the kind of advice that makes sense, right? He says, send your dragons and burn those ships. The ships should be pretty easy to toast, right? I mean, he's not wrong. Nina gives us a couple examples historically of dragons just torching some ships during the conquest. Visenya took Vhagar to Gulltown and just annihilated the Aeron fleet basically by herself. One dragon, one right. Of course, it's a big dragon, and that's part of the problem here is these dragons aren't big enough yet. She doesn't know how to control them. She doesn't want to admit that either. She just says, she gives different answers. It doesn't make Grolio very happy. Dany's answers to him kind of remind me of the old Mitch Hedberg joke about where people assume that you can do one thing because you can do something vaguely related. Like his joke was, you're a chef. Can you farm? Well, probably not. Most people who are chefs probably can't farm. And I mean, people who can farm know how to cook, but probably not at the level of a chef, right? And that's what Dany's doing here. She's like, well, you're an admiral, make more ships. And he's like, I don't know how to do that. And, it's similar to Jon talking to Cotter Pike and Dennis Mallister. Like, they're not on board with how difficult the situation is. They're complaining rather than offering solutions. So that's kind of part of the situation here. Both Grolio and Dany deserve some criticism here, I think. Grolio I feel bad for him. Nina does too. Joe does too. Like, he basically had to give up everything, right? Archmaester Rennie puts it pretty well here. Dany should realize that Grolio has basically sacrificed everything or had it taken from him. I mean, she's not acting like Cersei. It's not that bad, not nearly that bad, but the vibes are similar in that they're both thinking of prophecy that is in their life, like for legitimate reasons, that refers to treason, and they're kind of wary of where that might come from. So it's kind of fueling a little paranoia, more so in Cersei's case, obviously, but they do have, it is there. They have reason to suspect it, even if they're casting maybe too wide of a net. But Dany mostly just entertains the notion of it being prophetic and then rejects it. She's like, nah, probably not. But still, it's weighing on her. And Dany, of course, has regular reasons to look for treason, not just the prophetic ones. And Cersei, too, while we're at it. So, as Archmaester Emma puts it, and so did Joe Buckley by bringing up Cotter Pike and Dennis Mallister, yes, there's good reasons to complain, but it's all grump and no help. There's lots of complaining, but no solutions, no suggestions. Well, we could try this. Here's an idea, right? He's just complaining, so you kind of say, okay, Grolio, we get it. There's reason to feel bad for you, but maybe offer a little more help here. Don't just complain. So Astapor, this is, as Nina puts it, probably her most spectacular failure, at least so far. Maybe there'll be a bigger one, but this is the way she phrases it. I mean, Dany, right? She blames herself. There's certainly more to it than that, but from her own perspective, that's what really matters here, because Dany blames herself, and that's where we're running with it. Whose actual fault it is, I mean, that's not really that important to get into because there's so many different factors. We know Dany made some mistakes. We know that mostly it's the awful situation that already existed before she got there, and that undoing that is such a tall order. But certainly leaving behind a new government, this ruler, this weaver, and not the weaver, but the three counselors she left behind, she didn't give them enough military strength to make changes or to prevent getting overthrown. And that was her mistake. Now, she does recognize that, very importantly. Now, we talked about Cersei. That's something Cersei would not do. Cersei would not go, okay, I made a mistake. I shouldn't do that. Cersei would try to blame the three rulers. She would blame the people she left behind for not doing the job she gave them, something like that. So that's very different. Cersei would certainly not think of Eroa and make a metaphorical symbol out of this person whose life she tried to save, and in her mind she made it worse. Her eventual fate was worse. And Dany thinks I've made 10,000 Eroas. It's actually probably more than that. But she's also blaming herself for things that aren't really her fault. And you like to see her take on this responsibility. It's impressive, it's noble, and of course, extremely, extremely difficult. So she has to figure out how to get over the mistake emotionally and figure out what not to do next time around. And one of the biggest things is to not leave. That's something we covered last chapter. She has to stay and rule and not expect appointed rulers to do the job. So she's gotten all the info on what happened in Astapor. From her appointments, from the famine that came afterward, plague, war, and death. Okay, those four things, right? Famine, plague, war, and death. The apocalypse. And that's appropriate because we've already had this place likened to hell in numerous ways. She cut off the head of the snake there, but didn't replace it with something strong enough to hold hell back, keep it from returning again. Dany sees that the absence of a strong hand in Astapor contributed greatly to the downfall of the city. It's a huge reason she can't leave Meereen because she knows the same thing would happen. So if you remember your biblical apocalypse, the influence is pretty clear, right? Hence the name that we gave this chapter, Astaporocalypse. What happens to Astapor is horrific and does check off the boxes represented by the four horsemen. Some interpretations have the first horse as white, and that being a metaphor for conquest, with the final horse being pale and associated with plague, while others have the first horse as white and associated with pestilence, with the final horse as pale green and associated with death. So Dany could be the conqueror here, or Cleon could be, or both. It could be multiple representations. The second horse is typically red, representing war, often civil war, as a notable difference from the white horse of conquest. We needn't worry about which applies to Astapor because they both do. There was civil war and conquest going on. And Astapor itself is red, which is kind of a neat little parallel. The first city we saw in Slaver's Bay, too. The people Dany left in charge were slain by Cleon, and then Cleon was slain by his own soldiers. So that's your civil war, I guess you can say. All the while, Yunkai and their sellswords had besieged them. So that's war, civil war, conquest, and then, of course, after that, you get disease, pestilence, plague. So those bases are covered. Famine is the black horse, not just a lack of food, but a lack of common foods. This is an interesting detail associated with the four horsemen that sometimes gets left out of the discussion, meaning that luxury goods are usually still there. They're usually depicted as still existing, and they are here as well. Meaning wheat, grain, corn, those are inflated. They're available, but they're really expensive. And that was happening before the gates fell, but once it had time to get worse, then the spread of the plague happened, and that enabled that. This is all depicted here in this quote.
Inside we starved. We ate cats and rats and leather. A horsehide was a feast. King Cutthroat and Queen Whore accused each other of feasting on the flesh of the slain. Men and women gathered in secret to draw lots and gorge upon the flesh of him who drew the Blackstone. The pyramid of Naklaws was despoiled and set aflame by those who claimed that Krasny's Mo Naklaws was to blame for all our woes.
If you don't recall, Krasny's Mo Naklaws was the one who arranged the sale of the Unsullied to Dany. So, whoops. Yeah. So the black stone, of course, also matches the color of the black horse. He who draws it is eaten by the others. So he's the victim of famine through cannibalism, through extremes. Dany can't bring herself to think of these people as numbers or apples or ants, anything except people. That's what she thinks of them as. They're people she needs to protect. She kind of refuses to look at them as any other thing. She's just too pure, too good. She wants to help. Tyrion said it right. She's a rescuer. She's a savior. So what do you do when saving one group of your people will kill another? or likely kill both? What is the correct decision? Here, George gives us a moral quandary that there really is no answer to. It's the Edmure problem of Riverrun, where if you bring the mouths in your castle, you really make it harder to withstand a siege. But if you leave them out there, they're going to die. So it's really difficult. Here's the quote.
The cobbler told them how the body of the Butcher King had been disinterred and clad in copper armor after the green grace of Astapor had a vision that he would deliver them from the Yunkai. Armored and stinking, the corpse of Cleon the Great was strapped onto the back of a starving horse to lead the remnants of his new Unsullied on a sortie, but they rode right into the iron teeth of a legion from New Geese and were cut down to a man.
So each of the 3 slaver cities has its own green grace. That needs to be made clear here. That wasn't Galaza Galari, of course, who was killed. This hapless one was. She was impaled for her false vision. Now, file this one away in the back of your minds, as this is not unlike the debacle at Hardhome that we're getting pretty close to dealing with. We're certainly going to talk about it a little bit today, because it's in one of Melisandre's visions. The Mother Mole situation, which is a vision of Succor, this is actually a vision of doom. Mother Mole leads her people to Hardhome, and, well, pretty bad things are going to happen there. So, that's another example of people misreading visions, perhaps in the same manner as seeing what they want to see. And of course, that's very prominent in Melisandre's story. Both sides of that. And it's important to note here, too, that with this allusion to the 4 horsemen that reminds us of some Christian theology, Dany is looked upon as a source of hope and protection. There's a lot of Christ-like aspect to her. People who've gone through lots of hope and who are hoping and have gone through hell here through these slave cities, to follow these slave cities, or just before that, even living in them if they were slaves themselves. The Astapori gave themselves morale a bit by telling themselves Dany was coming to help, even as, we know she wasn't, even as things got really bad, even as they were getting sacked and starved and all that. It's important to note the power of hope here, and how much of a symbol she is for that, and how much it means to so many people around Slaver's Bay. It's not just the slaves, because these people begging and coming to her, the one hoping, the cobbler, the weaver, and the bricklayer, those clearly aren't nobles, right? They are not slaves either, but they were praying for deliverance and mercy just as much as the slaves were once, things got really bad. Not mentioned in that quote are the sellsword companies. We know the sellsword companies were a part of that. In fact, we heard from Quentin's chapter firsthand that it was them who reached the Astapori lines first, before this so-called legion from New Gis. The company, the Cat and the Windblown, were ready first. That's something to be aware of. The sellsword companies are, they aren't necessarily trustworthy as far as what side they'll stay on, but they are very good at what they do, and it's why people tolerate that from them, because, you really want them on your side. As with the Mother Mole and Melisandre comparisons regarding visions and hope, that detail may foreshadow other events. Don't let people tell you that the Slaver's Bay plotline isn't important. It may be far, far away in distance and in culture, and it won't likely play much role in the story's final endgame, though it might. But those cities these cycles of history play out everywhere. Power corrupts everywhere. Cruelty and heroism exist everywhere. What Dany learns about the Game of Thrones as played in Slaver's Bay will inform how she plays it, or kicks over the board, in Westeros. Jon and Dany having parallel but unique and isolating experiences is incredibly important for their future too, as it pertains to them having common ground to bond over later. That seems like an important thing, right? For relationships to form. Here's another example, an important detail. The butchery began. The Temple of the Graces was full of the sick who had come to ask the gods to heal them. The legion sealed the doors and set the temple ablaze with torches. Consider how similar that is to what Maegor did many years ago. Quote.
Maegor mounted Balerion and flew from Aegon's Hill to the Hill of Rhaenys, and, without warning, unleashed the Black Dread's fire. As the Sept of Remembrance was set alight, some tried to flee, only to be cut down by the archers and spearmen that Maegor had made ready.
So maybe this will be similar to what goes down at King's Landing. Massive fire, Golden Company on the outside, not letting anyone leave, or somebody. It doesn't have to be them, but that would be an option. Disease could be involved. That might be why they're not letting anybody out. It could be very similar. You would guess maybe of grayscale would maybe be the disease that would be the problem in this case, but it could be something else. And of course, it doesn't have to be King's Landing. Some other site, some other castle, multiples could suffer a fate like this. Speaking of the Golden Company, news of them and Dany's unwillingness to use the dragons is a big trigger for Brown Ben Plum to switch sides. But he's really sneaky and arranges himself a bribe. It's a neat thing to catch on reread. He's like, hey, why don't I go try to bribe the Company of the Cat or the Windblown to the Long Lances to switch sides? That kind of. And Dany's like, yeah, that sort of thing happens all the time. Give the dude some money. So he's like, I'm going to take this money and peace out. I have no intention of trying to bribe anyone except himself. So that's bad, except that it actually works out okay for Dany, since Tyrion and Jorah officially joined the Second Sons and forced the Company back to Dany's side, which Brown Ben Plum will, of course, claim was the plan all along. But we'll see how that goes. We, of course, haven't actually seen Dany's reaction to the Second Sons flipping back, nor to the fact that Jorah is part of them, but we're getting ahead of ourselves with that. Dany has goals far beyond all this. She denies Brown Ben the dragons and the notion that she's going to do certain other things, and misses this option. I think if Tyrion was standing there beside her, he would, or Varys or someone with a lot of court experience, someone with understanding of cynicism, someone would have seen this coming. We're like, I wouldn't trust him with all these bribes. He's probably about to switch sides. They would have at least considered that option. Dany, on the other hand, is happy to see Brown Ben and hugs him. And it's a really human moment. It's really sweet. But because she's lonely and she's stressed, and he's a familiar face who's been around a lot longer than most of these others. So that's going to hurt when he switches sides. Like, she even misses Jorah in this chapter, which is, she obviously probably wouldn't miss Jorah if she had new friends that were keeping her company and helping him out. She's missing any sort of company. So she's reaching for people that she's kicked away because she's got so few options. So it's really wild to see all these sellsword companies going back and forth. The Windblown are going to switch to Dany, even though Brown Ben Plum doesn't actually bribe them. And the Second Son switch away, but then switch back. The Company of the Cat and the Long Lances is probably going to stay with Young Kai. We don't really know that much about the Long Lances. The Bloodbeard is the one who kills Grolio, it seems, later. So probably not them switching sides. But before they switch sides, the Windblown related to us through Quentin's chapter, the last order they received. Tattered Prince is the one speaking here.
There's nothing left in Astapor but corpses, so they're pouring out into the countryside, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all starved and sick. The young Kai don't want them near their yellow city. We've been commanded to hunt them down and turn them, drive them back to Astapor or north to Marine. If the Dragon Queen wants to take them in, she's welcome to them. Half of them have the bloody flux, and even the healthy ones are mouths to feed.
So there's something interesting dichotomy I've noticed, that cynical rulers, people who can take advantage of someone else's compassion, which is what they're doing. They know that she's compassionate, and so they're trying to take advantage of that by burdening her with more mouths to feed and sick and people like that they know she won't be able to turn them away. This is very interesting because they're using that against her. What they aren't able to do is understand the other side of it, how much value it is to her to actually succeed in that, or to be seen as the one that does that. Their cynicism is so heavy. For example, I'm using we'll come back to this in the Reek chapter, when Roose understands what not to do to upset the Northern Lords, but he doesn't understand what made the Northern Lords love the Starks for so long, which was being a protector. Like Bolton, they're scared of him, but he doesn't come off like being a protector other than, I'm going to fight Stannis and the Ironborn. Other than that, he's, dangerous. You're scared of him. So this is a really interesting dichotomy in rulership, and how evil, I'm using the word evil very loosely here, rulers don't understand the benefits to being good, although they do see the negatives, which is one of the reasons why they shy away from being good, I suppose. So part of the reason this works, too, is that Yunkai is closer to Astapor than Meereen, or rather needs to be done. Sorry, I'm saying that again. One of the reasons they issue these orders is that Yunkai is closer to Astapor than Meereen. So left to their own devices, the refugees would go to the closest city they could, Yunkai. So, but they don't, with spears pointing them the other direction, they're forced to head towards Meereen, which is why the sellsword companies are employed doing that. And that, of course, is why Dany's going to have so many refugees there. That's why all these people are there, is because they're forced to go there. And one of the strategies debated here is how to handle all this. Barristan doesn't want to let the siege happen. He says it wouldn't be wise to let them surround us. For one thing, I'm pretty sure we can beat them because they're not a strong army. They're a patchwork host, he uses the term. Skahaz says it would be foolish to give up the advantage of their walls. They both have a point. They're both right, and they're both, maybe missing some of the other aspects. Now, they're going to go with Skahaz's plan initially, and then during Barristan's chapters, he's going to lead the army out. So we'll get to that when it comes. But in the meantime, what's going to happen, they're going to be invested, and the Yunkai they're going to keep the plague people out. They're going to decide that it's too dangerous to bring plague-ridden people inside the city, to hit the whole city with that. But Yunkai's going to give them assistance in that regard. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. They're going to use their catapults to start hurling dead plague bodies into the city, and there's nothing really much the people inside the city can do about that. They can't launch them back, not without touching them. So that is partly why Barristan is like, yeah, we really have to bring the army out of the city now, because if we just sit here, people are going to die to disease. Better risk dying in combat than just sitting here and dying to disease for no potential gain whatsoever. And with that, we wonder if Skahaz will take advantage of the army being gone and the fact that he has reasonable cause to think Daenerys is dead, and then go do the things he says almost every chapter that he wants to do to the nobility, kill them before they kill him and Dany and everyone else. It's a tough call because Skahaz has a point, right? He's not wrong. He perceives how evil they are more so than Dany does. Dany doesn't quite understand just how evil these people are. I think it's just part of her inexperience. She doesn't know how evil can be. But she has the right attitudes about so many other things. For example, when he's like, take names, I have names of people who are related to some of the captains on those ships that are besieging us. Let's go after those families. She's like, now I can't throw this offer back in their face. I accepted the peace deal. I gave Hisdar 90 days. She's not going to renege on that deal when they haven't to this point. So she has to play the good guy, and she's not going to. That's something she's not willing to do. Skahaz has a point about not trusting them, but she also shouldn't just go around breaking her word either. Barristan is. You like Barristan's wisdom with the army and keeping the flux away from it. You got to trust him on things like that. You trust his military strategy, his experience in that regard. But a couple people brought up this point. He's training a few knights, whereas Grey Worm is off training like hundreds of people, thousands of people, and you get the sense that that's a little more effective. Barristan's maybe a little too stuck in his own ways, and that might cause him problems later too, just kind of defaulting. You see this with him, where he just kind of refuses to adopt he keeps saying your grace instead of your magnificence. They just keep correcting him, and he just keeps saying your grace. And it's not entirely stubbornness. It's just routine for him. He's just so used to it. And this guy's been saying your grace for 50 years, So things like that. All of this, too, is Battle of Fire foreshadowing. All these moves they're talking about making that get delayed, the armies arrayed, the plans to attack them, who to attack first, where the weak points are. Battle of Fire setup / foreshadowing. Of course, some of the eventual elements haven't landed yet, haven't become part of it yet, but they're on their way. And there's so many of them. That's, of course, one of the episodes we've done long ago, Battle of Fire coverage. Hope if you haven't checked that out, this will be a good time maybe to get yourself ready for that. So Hizdar has been followed by Skahaz. Skahaz has been following him, watching to see who he talks to, because he's like, look, if this guy can shut down the murders, we need to know who he's talking to try to find out who they're talking to try to trace all this back to its source, right? But I think maybe they're missing something here. A couple of you pointed this out as well. Like, surely Hizdar and the Harpy and whoever all these people are, they're aware of Skahaz Mokandak and that he's basically Dany's master of whispers, the equivalent of that. And they surely know he's watching Hizdar, right? It goes both ways. So when Hizdar is just making this show of going to talk to people, it might just be that, a show for Skahaz to see, to report back to Dany, and they fall back on the same argument that has been pops up every once in a while in the chapters. We discuss it every once in a while in Valar, Rereadis. A little bit of coming along here. Whether the Harpy is a single organization, like a single leader, or an organization. And for example, another factor here that makes us pretty sure that there's a solo leader, or at least a higher up, maybe like a leadership council, is that, I mean, how do you keep all these people a secret? Like, we hear that Skahaz has been torturing lots of people. They've caught lots of Sons of the Harpy, yet they have not traced it back to any leaders yet. So either Skahaz is concealing the names, which seems unlikely. I think he might work against Dany, but not like this. Like, he definitely wants to fight against these slaver families. He's not on their side, no matter what. So it just doesn't really add up if for them to be a lot of different names if they're not getting any names, right? So it does really, more and more we go down this rabbit hole, the more it feels like there's one or a few highly protected names going on. Like, maybe even the lower people don't know those names, so they can't give them up. That would make a lot of sense. You torture someone, if you're worried your operatives will be tortured, well, if there's information they can't give up because they don't even have it, then you don't have to worry about that. And so this is all leads to Hizdar. Like, the only way this is going to work based on the current situation is that she has to make a sacrifice of herself, which is to take on this marriage she doesn't want to take on. And, well, there's just no other solution. She can't get at the Harpy. She can't break the siege. She can't send her army out because of what'll happen on the inside when her army's on the outside. So she really is kind of stuck. And this is the only way that she might get unstuck. She really doesn't have a choice. And she's thinks about it so much, tries to come up with other angles, but there just isn't anything there. Let's see here. Karen Sita sends a super chat from Canada, says, don't forget to give the video a like. Yes, it really does help us pop up in the algorithms more often. It's a small thing for us to ask, I think. Click that like button. And of course, you can always click the notification bell, too. That gives you notifications when we go live. You know when we're going live on Valyria's generally, but sometimes we have other live streams. Might pay to be notified when that happens. Dany notes that she's never seen a joust and asks when Barristan's knights will be ready. And he's like, oh, it'll be a while. But she is going to see a joust of Tyrion and Penny pretty soon. Michael Shelton says the corpse of El Cid was strapped to his horse at a battle during the Reconquista. Yep. I believe we touched on that briefly last week. But it's super cool, super neat real-world detail. And Rolling Knight says Grey Worm seems more effective with the training of many versus few. Like Barristan, I believe I mentioned that. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I mean, Dany needs a lot more help, and Barristan is training like 5 or 8 guys. It's like we need maybe do something besides knighthood. Maybe just train them how to fight. Just basic swordsmanship, spears, shields, that thing. You know. Maybe don't worry so much about some of the other stuff. Stefan B points out an interesting note here. There's a dream. We were always wary of dreams. Dany's, this particular one maybe isn't prophetic, but it might be, right? Dany dreams of Dario dead with storm crows above him. Storm crows, maybe. Betrayed by his own, possibly. I mean, he betrayed his own. He killed the other storm crows leader. But of course, he's not dead. He pops up at the end of this chapter, quite alive and, quite randy. And Well, it'll be next chapter that they finally sleep together, but she, of course, is it's clearly building up to that. Even if you were a first-time reader reading this, you could probably see it coming. She just thinks about him all the time. She can't wait to see him. She's worried if he's hurt, things like that. All the signs are there. Yes. Okay, so let's move on. This is going to be a long day, probably. That's a good thing, but, some of these chapters are beasts. That one's not so huge, but this next one is pretty big. Oh, looks like before we move on, super chat from Two Ravens, also from Canada, it looks like. Thanks for all you do. Stay well. You too, Two Ravens. Appreciate that. Hope everyone's doing pretty well. Holiday season's coming up. That can be stressful as well as relaxing. And, I don't know which of them it is for you, maybe both. So I hope whatever you're dealing with, I hope you can manage. Melisandre, straight out of Asshai, aka 1,000 Skulls and John. An incredible chapter just based on the fact that it exists. Just that much alone is amazing. It's also a great chapter just by itself, forgetting who the POV even is. At first, in concept, it seems to violate the long-standing principle of not giving POVs to characters who know too much. But within her mind, we see she doesn't actually know too much, right? She knows a lot, but she's ahead of the knowledge curve in some places while being far behind it in others. And the things she doesn't know are interestingly basic, like Daenerys exists. And the things she does know, well, a lot of them we learned before this chapter, but we maybe weren't sure she was telling the truth about. Inside her head, we get a lot more certainty, plus a lot more specific details, plus a lot more backstory. This is a fascinating character. We could say that with R'hllor rapidly rising in importance, it makes a ton of sense to give us a close-up on a Red Priest, right? And she's the perfect choice, especially since she's also a great option for a POV later, meaning after Jon's stabbing, she could step in and be our witness to a lot of that. So structurally, it fits really well as well in that sense. But it's a major milestone in that it's a one-off POV. There's not a lot of those, although there's more of them coming. And she'll probably have more chapters, of course. But it's a rare opportunity for George to show us things that would not be a fit elsewhere, but have applicability across an increasing number of plot lines. Like, giving us certainty on Melisandre's visions couldn't come in any other chapters. She can give us our visions, but we won't know that it's from the heart. We won't know if she's twisting words. When it's from her perspective, when she's in the actual trance and the images are flashing before her eyes, we know for sure that's what she's seeing. And that's just a different level of certainty that we've never had. And so that's one of the things that make this chapter fantastic, is that it's full of surprises, but not the kinds of surprises we saw coming. Like, we were surprised at the kinds of surprises we got. Like, oh, Melisandre, that means we're going to get this and this. No, we didn't get that. We got other things, because a lot of what we may have expected was maybe hidden agenda or why she's misleading Stannis. But the surprises come in a very Song of Ice and Fire, George R. Martin way, in the character, the type of person she is. That's where the surprises are. Her kindness for Devon, her lack of animosity towards Davos, who tried to kill her, her unfailing dedication to this important, all-encompassing goal. Is just a really great character. Melisandre is so cool. And it starts so very fittingly.
It was never truly dark in Melisandre's chambers.
Sometimes we talk about the experience of the first time read versus the second, but I don't know that we even have time for that today. Maybe that's something we'll tackle another time. Maybe we'll talk about that in the wrap-up, bring that up with Joe and Nina and Lady Gwen and see what their reactions were first time and get some of that from y'all. But there's so much else to talk about. We'll just leave that for now. As Nina writes, the opening of this chapter, that it was never truly dark in her chambers, is kind of a microcosm of her entire story. She's done some very dark things. She's murdered people by shadow assassination, urged Stannis to burn children. However, she doesn't do those things to glory in herself. They're not self-advancement. They're not self-aggrandizement. She doesn't enjoy it. It's got nothing to do with it. It's kind of like the reverse Roose Bolton. Like Roose Bolton doesn't seem to enjoy torturing people. He just doesn't think it's evil. If Roose Bolton believed that the world needed saving, you might see similar things in some ways, but he doesn't have compassion and goodness like Melisandre has, which is a giant difference, of course. But it's interesting how people can write off cruelty and really dark things when they have either the capacity for it, like Roose Bolton has naturally, or in Melisandre's case, she has the capacity for it because so much is at stake. For her, it's not callousness, it's expediency. I mean, she really, really does want to save the world, right? There is no doubt in this chapter or even elsewhere, really. So one of the tenets of R'hllor is that it's somewhat similar to sun worship, definitely not the same. It's different in a lot of ways because in sun worship you think of the sun being the source of all life, but here it's more like R'hllor is the source of all flames, and the sun is one of those things. It's like his number one son or something. Suns. It's the sun's son. R'hllor is the sun's son. We've been wrong all this time. It's not Quentin. But without the sun, whether you're a R'hllor worshiper or a sun worshiper, we're all screwed, right? Without a sun, we're doomed. I mean, that's the long night. So we need to pray to make sure it keeps coming back. That's a R'hllor attitude. So we can argue whether number 3 is true, whether prayer is necessary to keep the sun coming back. But the first two, that the sun is the source of life and that without it we're screwed, that's undeniable. On the Salisori Koran, we'll see Moqorro sleep through most of the day, then emerge around dusk to pray into the night, asking for dawn. And similarly, Melisandre says here, another day is given us. R'hllor be praised. The terrors of the night recede. So fire is sacred, not necessarily the sun, but the sun is fire. But it's an important distinction. The sun is part of R'hllor's gift, not its own thing. With bits like that, this chapter, it's like a crash course in Red Priests. Like I said, we learned about them already, but there's so much more here, and it's easy to miss some of them. We learn more about their powers and tools than their beliefs, right? I think that's the distinction. We learn about how their beliefs function, like what it is they think about, how their faith kind of operates, but not what they're capable of. This is the chapter where we learn what they're capable of, as well as what kind of person Melisandre is. So maybe this isn't the peak of Red Priestessness, but it is so far the peak, because I think there'll be more coming. It's the peak of what we have to this point. And we just had Benero. 2 chapters from now, we get Moqorro. So yeah, there's a lot. So where to start? With John's last chapter showcased a variety of magical things from her, as we went over very clearly. This is similar, except it's a lot closer and more personal. We don't hear her deliver visions. We see them firsthand. It's the full experience. We even somewhat experience her feelings, like how she feels during it, because these visions aren't just visual. I mean, it's misleading to say that, right? A vision is not just visual. No, she feels things. There's like a sexual energy behind it all. There's emotion to it. Sometimes there's sounds, I guess. So it's really like virtual reality almost, but more so. It's really like a drug trip in some ways. And we learn some ins and outs of her as a living being, right? Like she's apparently really old. She doesn't need to eat, but that's concealed, or best concealed from mortal men. It would make people a little freaky or freak out a little bit. And I think that's probably wise. But her throat does get dry. She still needs to drink to keep that lubricated, be able to talk properly. This is interesting setup because first of all, it's like, wow, they don't need to eat or drink. That's pretty surprising. But it's going to explain how Moqorro gets thrown overboard and doesn't die. It's kind of setting up that. It also reminds us of Beric, who Arya saw Beric not need to eat or drink, and we're told sort of off page that George refers to that as a fire white. It's a term that has been given to Beric. Is Melisandre a fire white or something like that? She does sort of refer to mortal men as if she's not mortal. And of course, being potentially more than a couple hundred years old, we don't know how old she is, but it seems to be multiple centuries probably, but even that's not certain. So it might be like a cousin of the fire white thing, you know. I think of what Victarion had done to his arm as maybe part of some sort of transformative process. Because clearly they don't just get told, okay, you're a red priest now, and then all of a sudden their lifespan is extended. And there's with Bloodraven, he's become part of the tree, and that's how his life is extended. So there's definitely some sort of apparatus here. It's not like you say some words and all of a sudden you can live longer. The fire is like in them, right? Melisandre perceives it that way. It's in her. Okay, let's talk about the powders, though. Let's talk about the non-magic stuff for a minute. Here's an interesting quote.
Powders to turn fire green or blue or silver. Powers to make a flame roar and hiss and leap up higher than a man is tall. Powers to make smoke. A smoke for truth, a smoke for lust, a smoke for fear, and the thick black smoke that could kill a man outright. The Red Priestess armed herself with a pinch of each of them.
So flames roaring and hissing and leaping up, that just seems like regular pyromantic tricks. You know, that doesn't seem like anything too special. Green fire. Well, that we're going to see 2 chapters from now. And Moqorro, he's got that dragon staff thing. Blue fire, I mean, you can see blue fire naturally. That's just really hot. But to make it blue, I wonder if that's all it does, is it makes it really hot. Maybe there's some like carbon, or I don't know what material that is, but that's fairly natural. It sounds cool though. Silver flame, I don't think I've ever seen that. We've only seen either of them in A Song of Ice and Fire through dragon flame. Dragon colors often have a match to their fire. But as far as these powders, I don't think we've seen Melisandre or Moqorro or anyone do silver flame or blue flame. Maybe we will. A smoke for truth. That is interesting. I don't know that we've seen that one. Maybe there's a time it was used that we didn't know about. Maybe the leeches, like when she's leeching people and she's asking them questions. I don't know about that. I don't think we have. So if we haven't, might be a chance, you know, maybe this is a setup for that. Maybe we'll see that later. A smoke for lust. Very interesting. A few of you wonder if she used that on Stannis, if that's how she got Stannis to, you know, break his, cheat on his wife or what have you. Or, I mean, Stannis is doesn't come off like a horny guy, right? He just doesn't seem that way. He's certainly not Robert, right? So he's kind of the opposite of that. So maybe he needed a little encouraging, and maybe this is what she used, a little aphrodisiac. High Priest Violent Messiah 666 coins the term lust dust, which I think we should all use from now on. Yeah, so if Melisandre uses lust dust, be on the lookout for that. But death smoke, a thick black smoke that could kill a man outright. Very, very sure we haven't seen that one. Well, 99.9% sure we haven't seen that one. So what is up with that? Talk about Chekhov's powder. Who's going to die to black smoke? Melisandre's going to take someone out with that, maybe. Maybe some black brothers after the stabbing of Jon. Maybe some of these powders could be used then. Maybe she could get the truth out of who led this effort against Jon. I'll get the truth out of you with my powders. And a smoke for fear. That's the last one that I haven't mentioned yet. That one we have seen. Here's a quote.
Mirri Maz Duur tossed a red powder onto the coals. It gave the smoke a spicy scent, a pleasant enough smell, yet Eroa fled sobbing, and Dany was filled with fear.
So Dany is too strong, right? That's a great sign of her inner strength. This is this semi-magical fear powder, and she resisted it. That's cool. And now Melisandre says she's running low on powders, but isn't concerned because, quote,
she was stronger at the wall, stronger than even in Asshai. Her every word and gesture was more potent, and she could do things that she had never done before. Such shadows as I bring forth here will be terrible, and no creature of the dark will stand before them.
We wondered last time who she would send shadows against. Here she strongly implies it will be against a creature of the dark, i.e., maybe those theories about her sending a shadow against a Bolton is a little premature, because you could metaphorically say he's a creature of the dark. But it seems pretty clear Melisandre is referring to literal creatures of the dark, not human beasts in human form or what have you. This idea that she's stronger even than Asshai, that is wild, right? That is impressive. Asshai is a haven for magic users. They go there to practice magic and to, maybe to be around other magic users. And it's this conundrum of, magic is supposed to be blocked by the wall, but clearly not her kind. It's made more powerful. So that is just super fascinating. Not something we really have answers on, though. And again, we wondered about if she sends a shadow baby north, can it cross the wall? I guess. What if she just passes the wall and lets it loose from the other side? Can it get into Bloodraven's cave? Maybe, maybe not. Is it because the shadows are stronger? Maybe they can penetrate some of those defenses, but maybe not. Maybe she still has to have a way around the wards. Okay, so let's talk about some other ways in which she's powerful. Her heat, the heat coming off her body. We talked about how intimidating that is got to be to Northerners or just people in general, how she just seems to not need like a shawl or a jacket or anything or a cloak.
Anytime I was outside, I would want to just huddle up to her.
Yeah, right? The line, where she walked, the ice began to drip. He will not fail to notice that. Yeah, damn. Like, that is evocative. Like, Jon's casting his shadow on the wall, which really says a lot about his future, and it's super interesting. Meanwhile, she's melting it. So it's just, they're very, it's different variety of character studies through what the light and heat around them is doing. Speaking of light and heat and around them, we got the glamours. We got this Rattlemance reveal. This is part of where we learn there's some sound as part of it. It functions on some level as part of the spell. Note how Mance gets Jon better than Melisandre does, at least in some ways. To be fair, Mance knows Jon better than Mel, so he should know him better. But Mance is like, Melisandre suggests sending him in the form of Rattleshirt to go rescue Arya. And Mance is like, no way will he agree to that. That's Jon Snow. He's not going to do that. He won't send Rattleshirt after his sister. No chance. And he's right? When Jon comes in and is confronted with this plan, he's like, you try to send him south, I'll cut his head off myself. Right? So Mance was 100% correct. And so Mel's like, all right then, let me reveal who this really is. And Joe wonders if there's any blood debt involved here. Like, well, Jon saved him, sort of, or Melisandre saved him, so he owes them something. But he mentions this thing about, I'll take these spearwives with me for a certain ploy I have in mind. What is this ploy you have in mind? Is this him telling us that he's got an agenda beyond fulfilling this mission? Because it certainly that would fit very well. Let's put it that way. We already talked last time about him going into Winterfell seems really risky and maybe beyond the scope of what he was asked to do, yet he does it anyway, which perhaps means there's more that he's after besides just getting a favor from Jon or fulfilling his mission. Possibly it's because the ruby is compelling him, but more likely I think it's that he's got his own plan. This is part of why people think the pink letter may have been written by him. I'm not sold on that, but I am open to it. And, well, his agenda, his motive is clear enough. He would want to get back to being in charge and to have a life again. But more importantly, he wants to save his child. He doesn't know his child is actually on his way to, or is in Old Town or Horn Hill by now. But he's operating on what he knows, which is amazing how many characters in this scenario are under the impression of false identity. Of course, the whole Arya mission is under false pretenses that are mistakes rather than lies. Because it's obviously Alice Karstark and not Arya. So yeah, Nina writes some similar things here. It seems that Mance was willing to participate in the rescue mission, but he also had his own reasons separate from rescuing Arya, and she also isn't sure what those might be, but it might be something to do with freeing his son or causing the wildlings to come fight Stannis. To fight the Boltons, because that is what happens, right? That is the result of the pink letter. Jon goes and reads it to the free folk. It gets them fired up, and they're ready to march south with him. You can see why that might have been Mance's goal, which is so, there are compelling reasons to think that the pink letter was written by someone else. There's compelling reasons to think it wasn't, too. So let's not get too stuck on that, because the pink letter is still a ways away. Now, of course, one fun detail here, the Dornishman's wife, Mance mentions that before the reveal. And of course, after the fact on reread, it's a pretty big giveaway. Like, Rattleshirt's not a singer, and it's Mance who has sung the Dornishman's wife more time, in the past. We hear him sing it the first time he's met. And this is a neat parallel because the first time we meet Mance Rayder, Jon thinks it's Tormund. So people mistaking Mance for someone else is already a thing. Literally the first time we see him, it happens. And here it is all again, but with the supernatural element to it. But let's try to talk more about Melisandre. We'll have plenty of other times to talk about Mance. Let's talk about Melisandre. Flame reading. Here we go. Let's talk about the visions. This is a big chunk of the analysis here. And then we get into her character. So flame reading. We'll start with that.
R'hllor spoke to his chosen ones through blessed fire, in a language of ash and cinder and twisting flame that only a god could truly grasp. Melisandre had practiced her art for years beyond count, and she had paid the price. There was no one, even in her order, who had her skill at seeing the secrets half revealed and half concealed within the sacred flames.
So how is the enhancement of that work at the wall? Now, she says no one in her order had the skill at seeing the secrets half revealed and half concealed. Now, is she puffing herself up? Because we see her make a lot of mistakes. But there's a way for her to be right. She might see more visions. Like if she sees 200 visions for every 50 that Daenerys sees, then she's seeing more visions. And out of those, maybe Daenerys has a higher accuracy count from those 50, but Melisandre has more quantity. Something like that. I'm trying to make sense of what she's saying here without calling her a liar. Either way, well, is this skill enhanced at the wall? Her powers are greater. Does that mean clearer visions, more visions, greater accuracy, some combination of the above? Worthwhile considerations we clearly don't have the answers for, but worth thinking about. With Mance, she gives accurate readings of what it looks like, the landscape, like the description of the lake, all that. They figure out that it's Long Lake. The direction, like they know that she's heading north. They know what side the lake is on. So it's pretty clear. You do get the sense that Melisandre does have clear visions of these things. It just comes to the illustration, or to the interpretation, rather. She knows a lot about Alice Karstark here. Like, she doesn't know that it's Alice Karstark. And she also says in that quote, no one has her skill. Is that so? I don't know. I mean, it seems like Moqorro is really skillful, and Benero, well, he said a few things. We maybe haven't had enough time with him to know. But it's a hard to rectify that statement with what we've seen elsewhere. So I think maybe we just need more evidence. So we'll just put that on the shelf for now. Here's a very famous line from her.
Yet now she could not even seem to find her king. I pray for a glimpse of Azor Ahai, and R'hllor shows me only snow.
And the S in snow is capitalized. That's part of what makes the quote so famous. She's looking at Jon. And does this mean Jon is Azor Ahai? It doesn't automatically mean that, no. Because she's praying for a glimpse of Azor Ahai and doesn't see Dany. And, okay, this is part of why Ash and I are proponents of the possibility, not the certainty, certainly not, we would never go that far, of the possibility that Azor Ahai is multiple figures. Because if Jon is Azor Ahai, then I feel like there has to be multiples. If it's only one, it's Dany. Full stop. But if there's multiples, then Jon would fit the next best, but way less well than Dany does. There's no stone dragons from Jon. There's no under the red star. And he just doesn't. He hasn't checked off these boxes like she has, and she did it like in the first book. the maybe times Jon did it are like, that's a stretch, man. I don't know if that really counts as the red star. I don't know if that's really smoke and salt. So. The other possibility is that she's not seeing Azor Ahai at all. She's just completely off, which is why I bring up Daenerys, because if she was seeing some form of that, why isn't she seeing Dany ever? Or if she has, she doesn't recognize what she's seeing. Nina points out something I strongly agree with, is that one of Melisandre's important visions that happened off page long before the story started was that she saw Stannis and Dragonstone and Azor Ahai and mixed up in her visions and thought that all meant something together. Thought those things were associated. Just kind of the same sort of leap of logic she has with Alice Karstark, making the assumption that it's Arya. That, okay, all these things fit. Dragonstone, Targaryen blood maybe, volcanoes, heat and shadow, this guy's in charge, it must be him. So it's the same sort of thought process, but you can see where this vision came from. Like this is the same kind of mistake. She sees the person, she sees the imagery, she sees all this stuff and just assigns it to the wrong person. So you can really see the underpinnings of both the process, the mistakes, and perhaps how it will all come around again. So she went, and it's interesting too that she went on her own. This is really fascinating. That something I give her credit for is that, she has acted on this well before anyone else, it seems like maybe the first person in the entire series before it started that was actively working on. Maybe Bloodraven's the exception, but that means a lot. Like Rhaenyra wasn't doing this ahead of time. Moqorro, as far as we know, no, she was ahead of the curve on the most important thing, right? That's a big deal. It's just that, if other people had been with her, if other people had been agreeing with her and working with her, some of those mistakes she's making might have been caught. That's the problem with doing things by yourself. Big tasks alone, and mistakes are inevitable. Take Dany, for example. So this is really cool. All this backstory and piecing it all together, you got some really interesting conundrums that we can't wait to see resolved. Well, let's move on to some of the other visions. Isla's faces again, staring out at her from sockets weeping blood. That's pretty straightforward, I think. Those are the rangers that the Weeper kills. And we even see them in this chapter. They do go out to see those heads, and Bowen Marsh, so let's take a little diversion from her visions to talk about this actually playing out. Bowen Marsh says they must have stayed up half the night driving the spears into the frozen ground, which is, Nina writes, this is time and resources, putting his men at risk to make a display of power. We can afford to stand here all night and do this. We rule the lands beyond the wall. This is our territory. This is our turf. But at the same time, they run away before anyone confronts them. So it's sort of a power move, but also a cowardly move. On the other hand, I have a second theory here. Maybe they didn't stay up all night jamming those spears in the ground. Maybe they have a giant with them. A giant could do that no problem, easily. And maybe a giant or two would be with the Weeper. It's possible. Meanwhile, Jon rips one of the spears from the ground by himself while 4 men struggle with the other 2 spears. He got 2 men per spear struggling, and Jon does one by himself. So every once in a while, we see this happen where Jon's anger seems to flash and he gets really strong. It's kind of like adrenaline, but it's notable because it's really powerful, and it is several times where it's happened. And I can't really think of any other character that has this recurring thing that happens. Like, he almost picked Alistair Thorne up with one hand, holding him by the neck when he got really mad at him. There was that time he jumped in the saddle while fleeing Ygritte in the Magnar Fen in the lightning storm and darkness when summer came among them. And he afterwards, he's like, how did I do that? How did I get on the horse with one hand, with one hand and my sword? And when in this book, when he's fighting Iron Emmett in the practice yard, and he's losing badly, and then he thinks of his family and he has these awful memories, and he goes berserk and doesn't remember it afterwards. He blacks out and he wakes up and he's beating the crap out of Emmett. And they're like, dude, stop. So that's I feel like this is the first time we've seen Jon's anger flash like that outside of his own POV. So that's interesting. And it just keeps coming. The chapter also gives us another possible conspirator against Jon here. This guy, Alf of Runnymede, the one who is extremely distraught at the death of Garth Greyfeather. The vibe is that Alf and Garth were lovers, and Alf might bear a grudge against Jon for sending his lover out to die. Many in the Watch didn't think it was right for Jon to be sending rangers out. And Alf would be aware of that disagreement, most likely. Bowen flat out says, we shouldn't have sent Rangers out. And Jon's like, don't say that right now. This is not the time for that argument. And so Bowen may have looking for conspirators. That's a pretty good target. You're like, well, this guy, his lover, is dead because of Jon's orders. That he might be a really good guy to bring into our conspiracy. Right? Yeah. So there's no guarantee about that, but it fits pretty nicely. All right, back to the visions. Here's an oft-discussed one. The towers by the sea, crumbling as the dark tide came sweeping over them, rising from the depths. All three, Joe and Nina and I, agree that it's Old Town. Most of y'all seem to think so as well. Some people still think it could be Eastwatch. Melisandre thinks it's Eastwatch, of course, but she even notes that the towers don't match. She says, that happens sometimes, but it's a pretty big clue to us, the reader, that she might be wrong. I have a second theory, though, that she might be right accidentally, because there is evidence that Eastwatch is in big trouble. We got dead things in the water near Hardhome. We got it's the people of Eastwatch, the ships and the commanders that are up there near Hardhome, possibly losing men. We did see Eastwatch really take it to the dome on TV. Now, I don't think it's going to be the same way, but perhaps they just got to point A through a different route. So I definitely think that the vision is of Old Town, and what we're seeing is visions of Euron's men taking it. But I don't think that means Melisandre is wrong that an attack isn't coming to Eastwatch. I do think Eastwatch is in great peril. I just don't know that this vision is evidence of it. There's other evidence of it, however. Additional evidence that this is Euron is how similar the wording is to Jojen's vision of Winterfell being taken by Ironborn, which was black waves crashing against the gates and towers and, quote, salt water flowing over the walls and filling the castle, rising from the depths, things like that. So it seems like a Greyjoy kind of kraken rising from the depths, water flowing over the tide. Very sea creature symbolic metaphors present there. The implication, too, though, what if it is Euron, if that is Old Town, the very fact that she's seeing that makes it relevant in a way that we may not have perceived on a first read. In other words, Melisandre's visions are very focused, despite the lack of Daenerys, they're very focused on the others, Azor Ahai, things like that. So if Euron is in there, if she's seeing visions of him, if she's seeing visions of Old Town, then that's relevant to the picture here. And we've explained in various ways in different episodes why that might be, whether it's Euron blowing the horn down there, whether destroying Old Town starts some sort of chain reaction of other places. The loss of knowledge could be a really big deal in terms of a weapon that could have been used against the others that now is lost. Whatever else they might have. There are artifacts that he might take control of. Who knows? Lots of possibilities there. The Forsaken gives us clues. So I recommend checking out our Forsaken episode where we go through some of those visions. It's really, really interesting. There's this quote in that one: the dwarves capering for their amusement, male and females, naked and misshapen, lock in carnal embrace, biting and tearing at each other. The reason that might be relevant is because we also have this quote: shadows in the shape of skulls, skulls that turn to mist, bodies locked together in lust, writhing and rolling and clawing. So it's the same thing about lust, bodies locked together, which is similar to that dwarf vision of naked and misshapen, locked in carnal embrace, but it's still very vague. It doesn't point us to like a particular plot line specifically, or are those just the others? Is this just a general struggle of life and death, as Tree Girl suggests? I don't know. Yeah. And definitely want to consider that. Will Melisandre have any connection to Euron? Maybe not, but when she sees this vision, she sees this mate, this character and his mate, the male and the female, laughing, right? And if that is Euron, then who's his mate? Is it a dragon? Is it Viserion? That's who has the pale flame. Is it Cersei? A lot of good questions there. This next bit: through curtains of fire, great winged shadows wheeled across a hard blue sky. Okay, that's one of the more straightforward ones. That seems like Dany's dragons. More evidence that they're Lightbringer. Lightbringer above the world, flaming sword above the world. Yeah. As far as who, like Melisandre sees Jon when she prays for a glimpse of R'hllor's instrument. I mean, Aemon saw Dany. Benero saw Dany. Moqorro's going to see Dany. So I think, there's possibilities for different people to be wrong, but it's kind of hard for them all to be wrong and Melisandre to be right. The more red priests we see, the more of them backing up not her. And then, so here is an example of one that's familiar to us, but not to her. This is a good quote here.
A wooden face, corpse white. Was this the enemy? 1,000 red eyes floated in the rising flames. He sees me. Beside him, a boy with a wolf's face threw back his head and howled.
Yeah, we do remember Bran howling, right? He did do his woo, back well before the cave, though. I don't think he's done any howling in the cave. So this is metaphorical, symbolic. The 1,000 eyes, 1,000 red eyes, 1,000 eyes in one of Bloodraven. He has one real red eye remaining, and the 1,000 eyes are his looking everywhere. When he was a master of whisperers, he had eyes everywhere. As a green seer, as a warg, he has eyes everywhere. And Melisandre is seeing that. So again, these visions are constructed of symbols, of metaphor. They are not literal, and that's part of why it's so easy to get them wrong, and part of why her certainty in her interpretations is a poor strategy, I guess you can say. It doesn't line up well with the certainty that comes from having really, really strong faith. Faith doesn't leave you a lot of room for doubt. It's kind of the point. Now, Melisandre is, of course, wrong, probably, to guess that Bloodraven and Bran are servants or champions of the Great Other. And because it seems like they're on her, not on her side, but fighting for a similar goal. They don't want, certainly Bran doesn't, and I'm pretty sure Bloodraven doesn't either, want Winter to overcome humanity or the others to win. But the reason that she may perceive him as an enemy is because she's mistaken about some things. I mean, he might be too. So symbolically, their goals don't align. In terms of symbolic, visual symbols, things are going to look different because they have different information and they don't know each other. Although she does note that he sees me, which is pretty cool, pretty creepy. If she knew the wolf boy was Bran, it's kind of funny. If she knew that, if she recognized and figured it out or learned that later, she might then realize that Alice Karstark is not Arya because there's no wolf face there. And the reason she's seeing a wolf face on Bran is presumably because he's a Stark and because he's a warg. Ditto Arya, right? She didn't see a green face. It's not a green seer face she saw on Bran. It was his Stark wolf-like aspect. Joe says, this all seems very major, like whether or not necessarily conspiratorially major that Bloodraven really is a bad guy, but the fact that they are currently perceiving, well, at least one of them is perceiving the other as an enemy. We don't actually know what Bloodraven perceives Melisandre as. That would be interesting. I mean, we get that chapter. 3 chapters from now is Bran's final chapter, but in that chapter, Bloodraven doesn't mention seeing Melisandre as Melisandre sees him here. So maybe that's coming later. Maybe it was going to be in Bran 4, which apparently George wrote some of and then decided to bump to the next book. Maybe there's going to be some mention of that. We'll have to see. But it's not this particular quote, but Mel, with all the skulls she's seeing, it seems like death. She's seeing Jon's death, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also maybe the rise of a lot more undead at Hardhome, quite possibly, which is maybe the reason she's seeing so many skulls. But another possibility for all the skulls is Bloodraven's cave, which she's clearly seeing somewhat here. An argument against that, though, is that she seems to only be seeing human skulls. And the skulls in the cave are like a very wide variety. There's like every kind of skull, basically. So maybe that one's not there. Okay, so now here is what we pretty clearly think is Hardhome, especially after having seen the TV shows, one where the TV show gave us a lot more clarity. Rare assistance in book knowledge through the TV show. Sorry.
Snowflakes swirled from a dark sky, and ashes rose to meet them, the gray and the white whirling around each other as flaming arrows arced above a wooden wall, and dead things shambled, silent through the cold, beneath a great gray cliff where fires burned inside 100 caves. Then the wind rose, and the white mist came sweeping in, impossibly cold, and one by one the fires went out. Afterward, only the skulls remained.
Yeah, woo, the mist. I mean, the mist that's death, as Joe writes. This seems to be pretty straightforward for representing a gigantic attack by the others, a mass killing potentially of a lot of wildlings there, and then raising them up to whites. That would be only the skulls remained, which is why the skulls seem like a pretty straightforward interpretation of an army of whites. And of course, the reason they're there, so many wildlings are there, is that Mother Mole's vision that I mentioned in Daenerys 5 as a parallel to the Green Grace's vision about victory. Mother Mole's vision was that there was, ships would come to take them away to, warm places or something. And, well, that was some sort of true, except it was to take them away to slavery. So it was another, careful what you wish for kind of thing. And this is also where we're going to get the really interesting, another thing that refers to TV show, the difference where ashes and snowflakes are kind of merged into one. And you remember season 2, we were all wondering about Dany's House of the Undying vision, whether that was ash or snow. Well, it was ash. It turned out to be ash, but it could have been either. This is, so it's kind of interesting how those two things can be mingled together, and it's hard to tell them apart. It's rich symbolic work there can be done with that comparison. The Grey Cliff, the 100 Caves, those are direct descriptions of Hardhome. That is absolutely what that is, and there's really nothing else that fits. Hundreds of caves with fires burning. That's been said there. Nowhere else that I know of. That Great Grey Cliff, that is probably not going to have a bunch of undead jumping off of it like it did on the TV show, but that is the Great Grey Cliff that's being referred to. And maybe they will do that. That would be wild. I wouldn't complain if that happened. That was cool. But one of the reasons Winter's army took so long to get going on the TV show, and ditto in the books, is it doesn't exist. First, the others wake up. Then they got to start assembling an army of corpses. Where are they going to get that? They got to kill people. And it's kind of a snowball effect, sort of pun intended. Once they kill a few, once they've got a few hundred, it's a lot easier to grow from there. This Hardhome seems to be like their great strategic maneuver where their army grows from modest size to double or triple what it was. And I actually think I keep referring to the TV show here because heck, we're talking about Hardhome. But one portrayal that actually helped us perceive this on TV was when Bran has that vision of just a bunch of whites just standing there, doing nothing, just chilling, pretty literally chilling in the cold, in the snow. We don't know where they are. There's some out-of-the-way location that's inhospitable to humans. But that actually makes sense. It might take a minute to get used to, but it's like, well, what are they going to do with their army in the meantime? They got to be somewhere. They're not just, they got to be somewhere. And they got to be gathering the bodies. They got to be adding men to their army, adding bodies to the pile, so to speak. So it does make sense. They kill as many people as they can, build up their reserves, and then bring them all to bear against the realms of men when they're ready. Heck, they've been patient. What's a few more weeks or months getting ready to go? Okay, here's another quote. This seems to be Jon's stuff.
The flames crackled softly, and in their crackling, she heard the whispered name Jon Snow. His long face floated before her, limbed in tongues of red and orange, appearing and disappearing again. A shadow half seen behind a fluttering curtain. Now he was a man, now a wolf, now a man again. But the skulls were here as well. The skulls were all around him.
Yeah, like that seems pretty straightforward. Jon's death and resurrection. The skulls around him is the resurrection, meaning he'll be undead. It also implies the people coming to kill him. The whole second life business is probably just how he will be a man and then go into his wolf and then return to his man body. That's now he was a man, now a wolf, now a man again. Now, that could also just be referring to his skin changing ability, but it could be both. And the flames, though, Again, this is another spot where there seems to be multiple interpretations. Very straightforwardly in both cases, I think. Melisandre being the one to raise him from the dead, using the magic of R'hllor, so the flames make sense that way. But also, Jon has Targaryen blood. So if you're going to bring up his wolf aspect, maybe throw in a little of that as well. So really beautifully done, really efficient vision there by George. Really, really awesome. There's also this line that comes near it.
Skulls, 1,000 skulls, and the bastard boy again. Jon Snow.
So, of course, that's why I named the chapter the way I did, this 1,000 Skulls and Jon, as a reference to Bloodraven. Now, is this just a general coming of the armies of the dead or something like that? Maybe, and again, maybe when she's asking for these visions, she wants to see Azor Ahai. Maybe that's just not her role. Her role is not to pump up Azor Ahai, or assuming it's Dany, and only Dany. Maybe her role is this, and she's seeing what R'hllor is sending her because that's her job. Her job is to, help Jon, help the Wall. That's her position in all this. Well, we're looking for reasons why she hasn't seen Dany in her visions, and, well, I'm grasping at straws. Maybe it's that. Let's talk about her process a little. Those are the actual visions, but in terms of how she thinks, Joe, I'm going to let Joe run with this for a second here. He says her first thought is that the skulls in the dream could represent the Bridge of Skulls, but decides they don't. But why? Why does she decide that? It's just a hunch. She's just winging it. She seems to completely miss that she also saw a cave with fires in a mountain. So she doesn't think of Hardhome. She's not aware of Hardhome. She doesn't go there. So she's thinking of other things. But if she knew about Hardhome, she'd probably choose that. And then, of course, we already talked about how she just kind of, oh, yeah, it just happens sometimes. The towers don't look right for it to be Eastwatch, but yeah, that happens. But she doesn't deliver it that way. She doesn't tell people of her doubt. She's like, well, I think it's this. She delivers everything with this certainty. And that's a big surprise for us, is that, yeah, it's the type of dishonesty. Prior to this chapter, not prior to the reread, but maybe on your first read, you may have thought Melisandre was lying. And maybe she is, but she's not lying directly. She's making lots of assumptions, and her process is flawed. So she shouldn't be that confident. But she is. That's how she operates. So Melisandre knows that with the skulls thing, with the 3 heads weeping blood, she's proven herself again. She's shown herself with the ghost manipulation, with looking like a grit. Her power is real, but as Joe writes very succinctly, that was a show of ability, not intent. It doesn't show that she's a good guy. It doesn't show that she's really on her side. It only shows that she's powerful. And as we said at the time, Jon was almost more intimidated than he was like, oh, yeah, this is useful. And so that's the Arya part. That's why Arya comes into this. If she helps Jon rescue his family member, something that has nothing to do with the War for the Dawn, something that's entirely personal, something that's just a favor to him. It doesn't help the military campaign really at all. At least not from her perspective. It actually probably could, but that's not what she's thinking. So she's trying to make it personal to give him a real reason to trust beyond just, he will use my power. And that's the same thing going on with the Rattleshirt situation. So let's talk about her as a person. This is getting into that. We're transitioning from her magic to the way she interprets magic, which is part of her personality. So let's dive headlong into that fully instead of straddling the two. Like I said at the start of this chapter, the surprises about her character are at least a match to the surprises about what we learn of her powers and all that. First of all, the great kindness. I touched on this briefly before. Devon, she's legitimately good to him. She knows she could manipulate him if she wanted to because, hey, everyone's attracted to her and her power and all that. But she doesn't have any sort of grand design on that. She's like, well, that might need to do that. But she doesn't look at it as like a ooh, cackle, like I have him. It's all just, this might be useful in saving humanity. Every advantage she gains, she files away as, this can help us fight the darkness. It's all for that goal. There's no doubt, there's no hesitation, no wavering, and I'll get a little for myself too. No, not even a speck for herself. Which is so cool because to this point, she's been one of the most black and white characters, seemingly, in the whole series. But that's a matter of perspective. When we get inside her head, It's different. And you realize that, hey, if you had convincing evidence the world was going to end, you might seem kind of nuts to people who didn't have that same convincing evidence. Like if you're out there going like, we've seen people on the corner of the street going, the world's coming to an end. In the real world, a dude preaching apocalypse isn't taken seriously, rightly so. If you have scientific evidence for it, that's different. we listen to, some of us listen to the scientists on certain issues happening around the world. But there is no such comparison here in Westeros because the flow of information is so different. There is no internet for everyone to log into. So it's really hard to put yourself in Melisandre's world. And it's really easy to see why other people would look at her as like a lunatic and how incredibly strong you have to be to keep going through all that. How sure you have to be. So this is part of why Melisandre doesn't delve into half measures, why she doesn't show lack of confidence. It's part of her attitude of keeping that strength. If she were to waver a little bit on the truth, it might slow her roll down. It might slow her confidence. It might impact her ability to sell this to the world, which is more important than getting the details right. It's more important that everyone be on board than everyone knows exactly what on board means. Because if they don't, then you might see the whole world gone. And then what good was it that you told the truth, right? These are difficult things like, when's it okay to lie? When's it okay to kill? These aren't things that we deal with in our regular lives for the most part. Maybe there's a few of you who have exceptions there, so I shouldn't speak for you. But generally speaking, you know what I mean. So she tries to win people over using these same mechanisms that soldiers are kind of used to by power, showing them power, real power, fake power, the trappings of power, and powder, powder and power. It's funny that Melisandre has almost stepped into the Davos role here with Devon for Davos's child. Has Davos saved Edric, and now Melisandre is trying to save Davos's kid. And interestingly, it's not mentioned, but Nina mentions the possibility that Melisandre had a vision prior to this chapter that one of the king's squires would die. Because one of the king's squires does die. Brian Faring dies. And if she saw a squire die, she'd be like, well, I don't want that to be Devon. So, interesting. And of course, all that power business, like showing how powerful she is and getting people, winning her to her side through her confidence and surety, it worked on Stannis, right? He didn't bend to R'hllor because he's a believer, right, in the power of these gods because of dogma, right? He did it because of the power was undeniable. He saw what she could do, and that was real. That's evidence. He also hates the Seven. He resents them because of drowning his parents. So the path was sort of paved. That's the kind of thing Melisandre would see as divine providence. Like, this man is ready to accept R'hllor because of tragedy earlier in his life. She would think, man, the god made it so. Like, that's the kind of thing she would ascribe to R'hllor's doing. And that's why she's so insistent about all this stuff about Jon being wrong. She understands this so well, the trappings of power and authority and showing who you are, getting people to do controversial things. You have to overawe them. She knows that really well. It wasn't necessarily clear why she wanted Jon to do that, but you see that it's been her life. Her ability to convince other people of the truth of R'hllor stems from that confident power and showing that power and overawing them. So that's why she's so adamant that Jon is doing it wrong. But she does give Jon some props. She does, even as she criticizes him, she notices that he does some things that imply he's aware of the need to show power, like not coming to her, making her wait on him. Right? Little power moves like that. He's not above that. It's still court stuff. It's still leader follower, but it's what the versions of those that Jon is comfortable with, where Melisandre says, don't make it about pride. It's your own youthful version of pride. It's anti-pride, which is itself kind of a version of pride. It's kind of like what Corran told Jon. It's like, look, our honor is worth nothing next to saving the realm. Pride needs to go that same way. Pride doesn't do you any good with this much on the line. So I tend to agree with Melisandre here. And of course, she has so much more experience. Like, Jon is what, 15, 16? Melisandre's hundreds? I mean, talk about life experience. She's so far beyond him. Now, to most of us, I assume burning people to death is terrible. Helping refugee free folk is good. But to many of the Night's Watch, those two things aren't that different as far as judging them as crimes. There's another really tricky perspective question here, whereas to us, it's straightforward, but to the Night's Watch brothers, it is not. Because many brothers will even see alliance with wildlings as worse than burning people to death because, hey, they're only burning criminals in the first place. Maybe burning's an awful way to go, but at least you're burning a criminal, whereas you're allying with our ancient enemy. I don't think that's worse because of the circumstances, it's not that simple. But you can see why someone like Bowen Marsh, who's been on the wall for like 50 years, he lives the life of the Night's Watch. He really lives and breathes Night's Watch vows. These changes are too much for him. And it's part of why it was really important for Jon to do a better job of either overawing them, showing his power, or at least convincing them rather than ordering them. So Jon's views sound rational to us, but to them, you got to keep in mind how insane and outright treasonous they sound. I mean, they flat out say that to him at a few points. Like, this is, some people might call this treason, my lord. They don't mince words about it too much, and eventually they don't mince daggers. More on her personality, finding out that Melisandre was a slave, that was a surprise. I mean, not, obviously you knew that from your first read, most likely. And this is coming on the heels of us learning so much about how the slave trade works in Essos, and it casts a different light on the dislike of her dreams. She thinks of dreams as the whisperings of the other who would drag us all into his eternal night. And then, quote,
"One day, Melisandre prayed she would not sleep at all. One day she would be free of dreams. Melanie, she thought. Lot 7.
So this is religious zeal hiding what appears to be real human trauma. I mean, again, possibly several centuries old, yet the one flash of a dream we have is of this, what sounds like an extremely traumatic moment, being sold at a slave auction. Do not allow the trappings of power, nor the actual power, distract you from Melisandre the person. She's really interesting and completely unique. This is a person in pain who understands that life is pain, that every day must be bought anew with suffering. It's bizarre to hear these words come from my mouth, but that sounds Ironborn, right? Like, I don't see connections between Melisandre and the Ironborn, but hey, Victarion is going to say something pretty similar to that later in the book when his hand is being worked on. A harsh view of the world is fitting for the Ironborn. So too does it fit Mel. Her life has been hard. She was enslaved, then indoctrinated, and she's been living that way for a long time. And so she never had a childhood, most likely. And so that's a really powerful thing in the real world. And here, what we can understand is what would be enormous human trauma is cauterized by additional, perhaps, centuries of existence and clear and present supernatural elements, which is something we have a little ability to actually understand how that would affect the big picture other than the total package we're presented with in Melisandre. So she thinks that she was this. Where did she come from? Of course, she studied in Asshai, but there's reason to think that she started in Volantis. Because one of her memories is of being bound for life to the Great Red Temple. Now, are there multiple Great Red Temples? Maybe, but the Great Red Temple is Volantis. It's the biggest one. Maybe there's one in Asshai too, but she definitely has a distinct memory of life before Asshai. And it's not necessarily connected to the slave memory. So it sounds almost like she was caught. Maybe she was Westerosi. Maybe that's why she has a calling to return there. Maybe that's part of why she wanted to go to Dragonstone. If her name was really Melanie, that's a Westerosi name. Certainly we've seen it once or twice in like Fire and Blood. And she thinks that she's been practicing magic for years beyond count. So, and we know she's wearing a glamour, right? So that would explain why she doesn't have face tattoos. Because if she was from Volantis, then she'd have face tattoos, but they could be covered by glamour. Another interesting and puzzling piece of her description is that the blood, when she's having a vision there, like there's blood on her thigh, which is part of, I suppose, the ecstasy she's feeling and the pain all at the same time. The blood is black and smoking, that's dragon blood. Dragon blood would do that. Now, I'm not saying Melisandre's a Targaryen, because she's been transformed by this fire over time.
But you are saying she's a dragon.
But it's possible. But I'm saying there's a chance. If she's hundreds of years old, who knows? She could be some Targaryen bastard or Valyrian bastard. I don't think there's enough to go on there. There's a theory out there. Our friends over at Radio Westeros did an episode on on her and include the possibility that she is Shiera Seastar. Personally, I don't think so. I don't think the timeline fits for that. But we don't know enough about the timeline for me to be certain. So I think you should check out that episode. It's really good. Also, just from her own perspective, these flames maybe connect her to dragons. She still doesn't even know it. Even not only has she not seen Daenerys, but she's barely seen dragons. She did see some in this vision here about wheeling in the blue sky and all that. So lots to look forward to with her. And another thing that gives her confidence is just looking. She comes to Westeros and looks around and sees the Seven. All these people are worshiping the Seven, and what power do they have? Like, none. And I mean supernatural power. Culturally, the Seven are extremely powerful, right? They have hundreds of thousands of worshipers, and that gives real power. But their priests aren't out here casting spells. They're not even using powders. So she's suffered more than any of them. She's lived longer. She's seen visions when they probably haven't. She's got more than faith. She has evidence. So she can really thumb her nose at the Seven and some of these other religions, even when they have supernatural power. She's like, yeah, the drowned god is just a demon, you know. She can put them all down because she's has this internal superiority of being so much older and more wise than everybody else that she doesn't come off as arrogant, but I think that's got to be in play a little bit for her. She just has so much more knowledge. So, I want to repeat my question. If we're going to get in Bran's chapter, his next chapter in The Winds of Winter, or whether we're going to see the other side of this, whether they look back and he sees Melisandre and feels her eyes on them and what his perception is, whether he sees her as an enemy or, you know, if he sees visions of her burning people, like he would be like, yeah, that seems like a bad person. Like, it'd be easy to get these things wrong. So that might be some real tragic irony if they see each other as enemies. Although it wouldn't be tragic if they figure it out before anything bad happens. So I got my straight out of Old Town shirt on today in honor of naming Melisandre after Straight Outta Asshai. Little joke out of that, or maybe you don't know where that all comes from. In the 80s, the rap group NWA had a song called Straight Outta Compton. That song was mockumentaried in the Chris Rock film CB4, where they had a song called Straight Outta Locash. And so that goes Straight Outta Old Town, Straight Outta Asshai, our versions. Yep, there's the explanation for that. Lady Leaf Underhill says, but is magic really stronger at the Wall than Asshai at the same time? Or is it just that magic has gotten stronger in the world since she was last in Asshai? Excellent question. I think that's entirely possible. She may be comparing Asshai prior to, you know, the comet and the rebirth of the dragons, and that might be throwing off her perspective. That's a really good take. I like that a lot. She may not have any idea. If she were to go back to Asshai right now, she may be like, whoa, actually, yeah, my powers are strong here too. Still, on the other side, the dragons have been awake for a while. Magic has come back for a while, and it's still a big deal that she's more powerful at the Wall. So whether or not Asshai is as she remembers it, it's still extremely notable that the Wall is like, wow. Guinevere Greenstone says, how long has it been since Mel has last had contact with her order? A new prodigy could have beaten her top score by now. That's true. That's a good point. Maybe there's some new, really talented newcomer that's only 100 years old. Only 75, looks 20. So yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. It could have happened. It doesn't sound like she's had contact with them for a while. It sounds like multiple years, at least a few years. Like certainly since She got to Dragonstone and started hanging out with Selyse. Eventually got Stannis' attention. So I would guess she's been in Westeros 3 to 4 years, maybe longer, and hasn't really had contact with her order since then. And a lot has changed in the 3 to 5 years. Grizzly Meadows says the opening lines of this chapter and the Forsaken are very similar except for light. It was always midnight in the belly of the beast versus it was never dark being in Mel's chamber. Oh, that's a good call there. Yeah, especially since we talked a lot about, maybe not a lot, but we called up Euron in several places here and mentioned the Forsaken and some of the visions in that chapter. Because if this chapter is up there in the top 5 with most visions, the Forsaken probably is too. House of the Undying, Forsaken, this one, a couple others. Yeah, top vision chapters. Constantina Lebensis says, regardless of Mel's age, though another thing that is strange is her physical agility. It's not just the appearance of the glamour effect. Hey, great point. She doesn't walk around like someone who's a couple hundred years old. She moves like with extreme grace and confidence and a straight back and all that. Good point. Yeah, so that was somewhat reflected in the Mance rattle shirt switch, like when he changed from bones to armor, and John's like, boy, he's standing straighter, he's taller. Must just be an optical illusion. No, it's an actual illusion. Another parallel, John Evaldson on Facebook noted the line, he sees me from Melisandre, which is really similar to Varamir's chapter when Varamir notes the whites are seeing him within his second life, within Thistle and or his wolf. So that's chilling. Yeah, very good catch there. Oh man, what a puzzle it is that Melisandre just casually mentions the finger bones. Davos's finger bones are the only ones we know of that have been relevant to the story to this point. But Davos lost his finger bones on the Blackwater. They sunk to the bottom of the sea. There is no way I can fathom, pun intended, Melisandre having those. Yet why does she mention it? Is George just messing with this? I gotta think. I've been thinking about this for years. And I've never seen a great explanation. So I feel like George was just like, there's a little cackle, like, I got them. Laura Boros wonders if the lust dust could explain Ghost's odd behavior towards Jon. Like, it wouldn't, she didn't hump his leg, or the way around. He didn't hump her leg. That would have been pretty weird if Melisandre was humping Ghost's leg. That's an odd thing to imagine. Let's see. Yeah, that's weird. But yeah, but still, jokes aside, maybe it has that effect of not lust, but something similar. It works differently on animals than it does on people. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it could be.
I still think it was just a sausage in the pocket.
Nothing like good old meat. We don't need anything complicated when meat will do. My favorite comment comes from our friend Archmaester Emma, who says, Mel complains about Jon living in the blacksmith's former quarters, but it's probably appropriate for Azor Ahai, a guy famed for forging a sword. Nice. That's really good. Yeah, I never noticed that, and it might even be very much intentional on George's part to have the guy that he decided to be like the mentor to Jon and the explainer of metal types as it pertains to Baratheons to be... He may have lined all that up on purpose with this forging the version of Lightbringer. Good catch, Archmaester Emma. And with that, we are done with Melisandre. Reek 3, a peaceful land of terrified people, aka My Dinner with Boltons. As with all Theon chapters in this book, his physical condition and trauma are part of the narrative, but while still prominent, it takes a backseat and focus to the actual Boltons, Roose and Ramsay. Their backstory, personal relationship, and strategy for the North are more of the focus here. There's plenty more of the Boltons in this book, of course, but it will be in Winterfell, which is going to be an environment with lots of other people around. So this is a look at the two Boltons in a very isolated scenario, and that serves to make this chapter pretty unique. Furthermore, it's in a location that doesn't have large amounts of world building nor personal association to our POV. Like, when Theon gets to Winterfell, he's going to be like, whoa, there's so many memories, but he doesn't have any association with this place. So it's really focused on the characters here, mostly on the observation of the Boltons. Theon's personal story less centered, but it's still there, of course, and there's some hints that his triggers are lessening a bit. Some of the things that are like provoking him, some things that are causing his trauma to like really come forward are lessening. They're weakening their grip on him. And like I said, yeah, when he gets to Winterfell, his guilt, his identity, that's going to really become more center stage again, because it's going to be the first time he's back somewhere he's extremely familiar with since being let out of his dungeon. And he's not going to be Reek at that point. This is the last Reek chapter. 3 Reek chapters in total. He's going to be the Prince of Winterfell 5 chapters from now. 9 chapters after that, he'll be a ghost in Winterfell. And he's going to finish his Dance with Dragons arc 5 more chapters after that as Theon. That makes this the 3rd and final Reek chapter, like I said. And that it's all the more interesting and notable that despite it being the final Reek chapter, it ends the last line with him insisting that he's Reek. A chapter so heavily focused on Boltons is, of course, going to be disturbing. A character who tortures dogs is pretty straightforwardly villainous to most readers' eyes, but it's so much deeper than that and worse than that the more we get into it. But even just sticking with the dogs assisting their master in evil deeds is pretty evil, and I'm not sure which is worse. The latter seems a lot more dangerous and insidious. It suggests the same level of violence, but with a lot more sophistication. Dogs are just widely beloved. They've been living alongside humans for eons in a wonderfully symbiotic relationship. There's something deeply unsettling about turning that innate goodness of dogs into such abject evil for just for minor pleasure, right? It feels like the human equivalent of child soldiers, easily manipulated because they're trusting and young and impressionable, just like dogs. That comparison comes to mind in part because that line is blurred in the way they're written. Quote,
He heard the girls first, barking as they raced for home.
Girls, right? So the connection to people is very intentional here because as Roose is a product of his forebears, Ramsay is a product of Roose, these dogs are a product of Ramsay. They are all children with a bad father, bad parenting. Sometimes these dogs are called hounds, which literally is the proper term for hunting dog. But most often, they're called girls. Ugh. Worse, of course, they're named after real girls hunted by these very dogs. It's another level to this perversion of the innate goodness of dogs, to name them after horrific crimes they were trained to commit. It is at least fitting to that end that the dogs like Theon, though. It was Theon who wanted to help Kyra escape the Dreadfort, and Theon is going to help Jane escape Winterfell and Ramsay. And, well, 2 of the dogs are even named Jane. Grey Jane, Red Jane. And the language here speaks of them being reborn as dogs, which just really fills out the symbolic comparisons here. It makes it feel all the more evil at the same time. If you're good at being prey, you get to be predator. If you're good prey in this life, you can be predator in the next life. It's also, like I said, a tie-in to the others. They kill you and reanimate you and make you theirs and do your evil, violent bidding. Usually the killings they do are done by prior people they've killed too, right? The others kill some people, then send those dead to kill more dead. Not unlike this, Ramsay killing women with dogs named after previously killed women. It's a similar cycle. There's no doubting the grossness of all this, but as we can see, it has a purpose. It is thematically rich. It connects to the way other parts of the story are being told. Thus, it's just not shock value. It is shocking, but it's not shock value only. It's an interesting thing. Like, you can have shock value and still advance or enrich the plot, which is definitely happening here. Of course, the dogs have been around plenty before in this chapter, but they're particularly front and center in this one, and they serve as such great dark symbols of the Boltons themselves. They have that first line, they wrestle him, we're told they're fond of him. For a moment, for half a second, they seem like good dogs, but then they're rough with rough with Theon, even though they like him. Really rough, and he's like, ah. Ugh. Then they proceed to kill their host's dog. It's super sad. It's at least one person called it one of the saddest moments of the book. It's also just a huge statement on Ramsay's lack of empathy. That's this guy's pet. Not only is it a huge insult to kill your host's dog, I mean, just to kill anyone's dog is enormously repulsive. But he does this amidst forcing the guy to throw him a huge party that's threatening his winter stores. His ability to survive is threatened, and casually his pet is murdered in the process. I mean, yeesh. So the concept of child soldiers and murder dogs overlaps even more when we look specifically at how Ramsay was raised, right? Not through a different method. Like, these dogs are more directly abused with through physical means, starvation and, beating them, things like that. Whereas Ramsay wasn't beaten. He was just parented awfully. Not just bad parenting, not absent parenting, a distinction we made in the previous chapter of Melisandre, but evil parenting. The Dreadfort has its traditions, and the implication is stunning here. It seems that there have been many others like Roose. When Roose tells his son all these things, you don't get the sense that Roose figured these things out for himself. When he talks about boot leather made of humans, when he talks about how power needs to be wielded, how he talks about cutting tongues out and keeping people quiet, you don't get the sense that he figured this out on his own. You get the sense that this is how it's been at the Dreadfort for centuries, if not eons, that Roose learned that from his dad. What we're seeing is a father-son moment that is played out dozens, if not hundreds of times over the course of Bolton history, where these family secrets are passed down. And the family secrets, the family knowledge that the Boltons hold is so disturbing. That's knowledge that should be banished from Earth. That's the kind of book we can burn. The Library of Bolton, that we can burn. The library at Old Town, I wish that would stay. Unfortunately, it's probably going to go the opposite. Bolton's probably not going to burn. The characters may, but the Dreadfort probably won't go anywhere. Ramsay is told by Roose it's wrong to do these things that he's done at the feast. Not because it's morally wrong, because it's not pragmatic, because it's anti their goal of power, of supremacy. It doesn't help with that. It's caving to a lesser desire, right? It's like you want to feel personally good about what you're doing rather than maintain this grip of iron and ice over the North, over this realm, which was previously only the Dreadfort. He wants it to be the entire North. This coldness extends to Ramsay's amusements, as Roose puts it. He doesn't care that Ramsay skins people. He doesn't care about chasing people with dogs. It doesn't mean anything to him. He's so callous that he isn't even a little disturbed by it. He's just like, don't get caught. You keep getting caught, man. That's the problem. It doesn't matter that you're doing it. It matters that you get caught. And that gets us into this whole quiet thing. The quiet people. A peaceful land, a quiet people. They're a terrified people. They don't want to act up because they don't want anything to happen to them. They do not want Roose to notice them. They want to be ignored. They truly, when Jorah tells Dany the commoners just want to be left alone, it's doubly, triply, quadruply true in Bolton lands. They really just don't notice me, Lord Bolton. Just don't notice me ever. Let me live my entire life without you knowing I exist. There's a repeated saying about the Roman Empire that they can burn down everything in sight and call that peace. Technically it is, but it's not good. There's no life there. It's Miri Mazdur version of life. What good is life when all else around is lost or when everything else is gone? It's not. Roose doesn't tear out tongues because he likes it, nor does he think it's immoral. It just serves a purpose. He has no qualms. It's like, well, if I do this, it'll have this result. The person's feelings are irrelevant to the matter entirely. It's all about getting the result he wants or doesn't want. Those are the only things that come into consideration. Tear out a tongue every once in a while, people are going to watch what they say to you, especially if they are aware of it. So almost everyone's going to be quiet and certainly won't speak out against you, or they're going to be afraid to have the same happen. And since illiteracy is so widespread, well, there you go. It's extra effective. It's not like they can go writing things down. We saw that with Wex. There is ways to get the truth out of tongueless people, but they can't go writing it down. And the difference is highlighted here in the case of this peasant with the goats who calls Ramsay Snow. We're not meant to think this old man was mouthing off to Ramsay. No way. I do not buy that for a second. Who would provoke Ramsay like that without a sword in hand and an army at their back? Not some old dude walking with goats. He's not going to do that. He just didn't know better. He probably had no idea Ramsay had been legitimized. That's his name, Ramsay Snow. So he called him by it. Roose would not have handled it that way. Roose wouldn't have killed a perfectly productive peasant unless he had to. That's a taxable peasant. That's his peasant. He owns that. Why would you kill something you own? That's how Roose envisions it. But to Ramsay, it's a plaything. He can do what he wants with it. If killing it is perfectly logical, it's ownership either way. But Roose is like, this is anti-pragmatic. Why would you destroy a perfectly valuable resource? So in no case is there compassion here. It's just different forms of ruthless pragmatism. One is like, I want to self-aggrandize myself. I want the pleasure of torturing this guy and showing my power. Whereas Roose is playing more of a long game of protecting Bolton supremacy. Either way, as we addressed at the beginning of the episode, these peasants are barely above the status of slaves. If Ramsay can just do that to someone whenever he wants with no repercussion, if Roose Bolton can just rape a woman because he likes her when he's passing by, what rights do they really have? Like, if he can do that, he can do anything he wants. It's really just a matter of, again, you just hope he doesn't notice you, and then you can maybe avoid the worst. It's no coincidence that as the chapter opens, Nina writes, Theon is shown wearing the same sort of chains we saw Jorah put Tyrion in, right? Ramsay never calls Theon a slave, but he basically is, right? He treats him like a dog, makes him sleep with them, forces him to smell bad, won't let him use his own name, things like that. Tortures him whenever he feels like it, even if he doesn't do anything wrong. So Roose isn't wrong about Ramsay being full of hate and anger and that being a big problem. Amidst all of Roose's casual awfulness, that advice is actually good. Anger, being destructive, that's pretty true. Ramsay sees insults in everything, though, even that, and is too arbitrary for his own followers to be at their most effective. This is a good example of, like, good leaders get the most out of the people they are leading. Quite the opposite from someone like Ramsay. He gets the least out of them. He gets the worst out of them. Sometimes the worst meaning their worst ability, but also their worst aspects of their personality. Also, Roose's prescriptions of leechings is highly questionable here. He's like, yeah, anger, that'll take care of his anger issues. Leeching, like what? We hear about the original Reek, killed way back in the Clash of Kings, and Roose wonders if Ramsay corrupted the original Reek or the other way around. But that is definitely the wrong question. First of all, the main corrupter here in all this is you, Roose Bolton. You're the major influence here. You're the guy with all the power. You're the one that had the ability to put these two awful people together. He says they became inseparable. Well, he could have separated them. He could have not put them together in the first place. What kind of person would become great friends with Ramsay? What does that say about Reek? That he became inseparable with that guy. Like, what sorts of things did they bond over? Yeah. So they fed off each other. They both built each other's evil up over time, and Roose created this. Roose created the entire situation, all of it. He created the bad feeling in the woman by raping her and then dealing with her family the way he did. Then raising Ramsay this way. I mean, it's purely karmic. All this is coming back to bite him, and it's probably going to end in his death. I polled Twitter, who's going to outlast who? Roose going to live? Roose outlast Ramsay, Ramsay outlast Roose. 64% voted Ramsay will outlast Roose. I agree with that. Let's get into why. Paired with Ramsay's overwhelming capacity for hatred, his temper is the thing that could really get him. And this moment really feels like setup for that. Here it is. Reek saw the way Ramsay's mouth twisted.
Reek saw the way Ramsay's mouth twisted, the spittle glistening between his lips. He feared he might leap the table with his dagger in his hand. Instead, he flushed red, turned his pale eyes from his father's paler ones, and went to find the keys.
He's been savagely insulted in that moment. He's just been called a bastard, which we've been over is a huge no-no, and he's been told to give up Theon, who he thinks is his. Ramsay is so angry in this moment. He tells Theon that he's going to cut off a finger when he brings him back, even though Theon has done nothing, obviously. So I think if this provocation had been just a little worse, like a few notches higher on the angry meter, Ramsay may have snapped. I think that's what's being set up, is that next time maybe he will snap. And Roose doesn't fear the possibility. An argument I've seen out there is Roose is too careful and cautious to let Ramsay kill him. The evidence for that is all over the place that Roose is very cautious. He does the body double thing at Moat Cailin. He leads from the rear. He keeps his guards with him. But in this scene, he doesn't. He sends all his guards away. He is arrogant towards the danger of his son, even though he knows he's a kinslayer. It's an interesting conundrum, but I think it's partly just that arrogance, that same contempt that we see Tywin show Tyrion. And we know how that one ended. It treats your progeny badly, disinherit them, which might be what happens with Roose and Ramsay. It's an interesting contradiction because he does seem like a highly cautious man, but he's really uncautious here. He's completely by himself with Ramsay and only Theon. If Ramsay wanted to stab Roose, it would happen. Nothing could stop him. And I have to think there might be another opportunity for that later. We may have already seen it when Ramsay and Roose and Walda are arguing. Theon sees them in the distance. Walda looks really scared. It might be that Walda has just informed them that she's pregnant, and Roose may very well be like, okay, Ramsay, you've got the Hornwood, you've got Winterfell, my child with Walda is going to get the Dreadfort. There you go. Disinheritance, anger, calling him a bastard again, maybe, snaps and stabs him. Something like that could happen. And that's kind of what happened with Tyrion, right? He snapped and shot him. He's like, provoke me again and I'll shoot you. Yeah, he shot him. So they may end up with a lot in common. Of course, I don't mean that Ramsay and Tyrion have a lot in common as characters, but in their upbringing and in their comparisons between their fathers, like Tywin and Roose, yeah, there's a lot there. In fact, he laughs at Ramsay's attempts to plot against him. When he asked him, he's like, what did he whisper to you? He's like, that fool, does he really think those men are his? He's really arrogant about it. He's contemptuous of the possibility of Ramsay's ability to operate against him. So again, I think that if you're a person that has noted Roose's caution, you should also take note of this blind spot. He doesn't have that caution towards his son. And again, I point to Lady Dustin, who we referred to last time. She refers to Roose as a man who sees life as a game. Tyrion says the same thing, but with bitter sarcasm, in part because in that moment, Tyrion is losing the game of life, not Game of Thrones, whereas Roose right now is winning. Again, for now. This line, too, expresses the lack of empathy in the Boltons. The Boltons' pale eyes looked empty in the moonlight as if there were no one behind them at all. Yeah, right? Like there's no humanity behind them at all. There's a walking, talking, breathing person, but is he human? Literally, yes, but figuratively, I don't know. I think we might be able to write him in the category of something else. Right here in this chapter, too, we get an idea of what it might be that sets Ramsay off. We talked about that. He's willing to kinslay, right? So you might be like, well, would he really scruple to stab his father? Yeah, of course he would. He's killed his brother, probably, at least according to Ramsay. I mean, at least according to Roose. And Roose also mentions how fertile his wife feels, how he likes being with her. This is all set up for children coming from that union, which leads to problems from Ramsay. At the same time, though, Roose expects Ramsay to kill any children he has with her, but Nina suggests maybe he's saying that because he knows Ramsay's going to hear it back from Theon. Roose is using perhaps Theon as a conduit to pass information on to Ramsay that he doesn't want to tell him directly, which we'll later see Lady Dustin do in reverse. She's going to pass information through Theon when they're down in the crypts. She's going to say, nothing I told you is to pass your lips. But of course, she doesn't really expect him to not tell. She wouldn't give up secrets so casually if she was worried about him repeating them. Not Theon, not a weakling like that. She has contempt for him. She wouldn't give him any secrets that she really needs kept. So that's your clue that he actually is meant to pass them on, or that she expects him to. Same here. When Roose is unconcerned with the notion that Theon is going to pass secrets to Ramsay, he's like, don't worry about it, man. Breathe deep. I don't care. So it's again this contempt. And this is, of course, the same thing. Like Roose and Ramsay, Walder Frey is not an idiot. He's ruthless, But one of the reasons the Freys sent an entire army north with Roose is because they probably fear the same thing happening. They want their child with Walda to get the dread for it. They don't want Ramsay to get it. They are surely aware that's a possibility, but that's part of the reason to send all those soldiers there. Like, you don't normally do that. Send a huge army as like a dowry. Especially when you have a bajillion other daughters and granddaughters, right? Like, Walter's like all the daughters and granddaughters he's had. And only one of them got an army sent with them to their new home. And it just happens to be the Boltons. Like, there's definitely a lot of thought that went into this. Walder didn't do this casually. So
I mean, only one of them is going into a region where they killed huge swaths of people.
That's true too. But I think the point is not just that he's sending the army to protect them against the other Northerners, but he wants them to protect his own kin as well, if it comes to that. So yeah. And of course, there's the big Walder and little Walder there too. So and since Bolton sort of stood up and mentioned them as hostages at the Red Wedding, he might be considering keeping them safe as well. And of course, these are relatives. Like, Fat Walda comes from the same branch of the Freys that Aenys and Hosteen come from. So you can tell they're planning on a long-term presence in the north, right? That army is probably intended to stay. Because not only do they have those marriages, but there's the Manderley marriages that at this point they don't know have been thrown off. Those Freys are dead already. But as of last thing we saw, the marriages had been agreed to. So that's a lot of Northern/Frey marriages, all of which are being thrown off, basically, except for the Walda Bolton one, which might end in death. So Ramsay, in this conversation, manages to mention a way in which he could lose just about every ally they have, which is in a variety of specific ways that repeatedly disgusts Roose, which feeds into the contempt he has for his son. But also, it really shows, along with this quote, what Ramsay's setting himself up for. Let's hear it.
Fear is what keeps a man alive in this world of treachery and deceit. Even here in Barrowton, the crows are circling, waiting to feast upon our flesh. The Serwins and the Tallhearts are not to be relied on. My fat friend, Lord Wyman, plots betrayal. And Horsebane? The Umbers may seem simple, but they are not without a certain low cunning. Ramsay should fear them all, as I do.
Between not considering the dangers he's in and between all the many provocations, between his likelihood of losing his temper and upsetting people in other ways, the people he's already upset, like Lady Dustin, Ramsay just has self-destruct written all over him. That's one of the things that makes sense as far as him outliving Roose. Because if Ramsay kills Roose, the Bolton alliance collapses quickly. Stannis will win almost no problem because Ramsay would just lose some of his allies probably right away, and let alone being not nearly as clever as his father and capable of making many other mistakes. So that would be a good way, perhaps, for George to have this all unravel on the Boltons is just this from within, which makes so much thematic sense. Roose created this, and this karma, coming all back to bite him and kill him and end it and break everything he's built. Everything he's kept so safe for so long, he's going to ruin it by some casual cruelty 20-some years ago. The vibes are similar to Volantis, right? Meaning they're in control and everyone's afraid of them. But it could turn quickly. Like when Dany comes along, people will rise up in Volantis. Here, the Boltons have control, and when, Stannis comes along, people may rise up, or Jon, who knows? It's a similar kind of situation where there are beloved leaders they would rather follow but they're afraid of these current ones. Here's another important difference between Ramsay and Roose. These aren't exactly settled terms even amongst experts, but from my layman's knowledge, my basic research, Ramsay is more of a sociopath, Roose is more of a psychopath. In general, psychopaths are cold, cunning, and controlled with their mannerisms and actions, which definitely describes Roose. Sociopaths are more likely to be hot-headed, and they don't care as much what other people think of them. That is both of them to a T, right? Ramsay is in this chapter like, I don't care what they think of me. And he's definitely hot-headed. And that's why he has so many slips of the tongue in this chapter. He's like, I didn't, like Theon did the thing. He's like, no, you didn't do that. The Ironborn did that. Don't stop. You keep your lies straight, damn it. So even within our two Boltons here, it seems like we have an ice and fire dichotomy. Roose is the cold and Ramsay is the hot. And you can see that they don't work very well together. Like they're arguing, it's petty. Roose is contemptuous. He rolls his eyes. Ramsay says dumb things. He's over aggressive. He's not thoughtful. So, But even in terms of feeling fear, this is where the psychopath thing is kind of reversed, because psychopaths are usually the fearless ones, while sociopaths are not. But Roose maybe doesn't feel fear. I think he does, but he certainly understands the value of it in expressing it and pointing out that Ramsay doesn't seem to have it. And despite Ramsay inflicting such direct, horrendous trauma on Theon, shown in part by his refusal to be bathed or to go by a different name, despite the first-hand horrors inflicted by Ramsay, he still recognizes Roose as the more dangerous of the two, which is really telling. You got a guy that tortured you, but you can still have the presence of mind to recognize the father who hasn't touched you is worse. Whoa, that's telling about how bad Roose is. And I don't think he's wrong. I think he's right to feel that way. Like, Ramsay is more likely to torture you, but Roose's evil is more likely to last, more likely to infect more people. It's more likely to live on for generations. And in fact, it has. This recipe for success, quote unquote, that Roose has, as I said before, is most likely passed down to him from prior Boltons who had learned what you can get away with, what you can't, what you need to hide, how to hide it, etc. So this place is called the Dreadfort. I mean, the sigil is a flayed man. Like, the rumors are they have skins hanging in a room. So it's not like they can be that subtle about their behavior, but they have plausible deniability that, hey, this is how it used to be. We used to do those things. That room sounds like something from the House of Black and White with the skinned faces, but yeah, the Roose could be like, oh yeah, we've progressed. We're not like that anymore. And they want that. They want people to think that those traditions have died out. But Roose alludes to old traditions dying hard. He doesn't talk about flaying traditions at the Dreadfort. He doesn't talk about Bolton-specific traditions. He talks about northern traditions that we mostly thought were gone. Really gruesome ones like the First Night, which basically is what happened. I mean, that First Night is how Ramsay was born. How Skagos is potentially worse is something he casually mentions. It's like, whoa, are we going to see that through Davos's perspective, or is it going to turn out that they're not as bad as it seems? Maybe so. If these things are being hidden, if First Night is just being hidden from the Starks and from the kings of the Iron Throne, if Roose is right that there's lots of other old traditions that are kept under wraps, then maybe there really is a room with skins at the Dreadfort, like the House of Black and White, but without the magic. Yeah, I mean, these things are very possible. It's just they're good at concealing it all. I mean, and who's going to come check, right? And like, let me check every inch of your castle for secret skin rooms. It would be pretty easy for them to keep it hidden. So, but Ramsay is directly working against this carefully cultivated secrecy that the Boltons have apparently been keeping up for centuries. Remember that in A Clash with Kings or A Storm of Swords, I forget which, maybe both, Roose is like, yeah, my son's done some awful things. Robb will just have to judge that. He's detached from it. He's like, yeah, you're probably going to have to punish him. So he kind of acted like, yeah, washing his hands clean of it, meanwhile, by playing both sides. So with the way Roose speaks about his other son, his dead son, Domeric, I think we're not meant to actually take him at face value because of his own attitudes. If Domeric were a torturer, would Roose bring that up? Would he hold that against him? No, he wouldn't. He wouldn't. They wouldn't stop him from praising him. He calls him an accomplished boy. But he also said Ramsay has a singer's soul. Like, Ramsay has a singer's soul? I mean, he also insults him to his face multiple times. But if Roose can call Ramsay as a person with having a singer's soul, then calling Domeric an accomplished boy is like, what does that really mean?
Do you think Roose just hates singers?
Maybe.
He thinks they're all awful.
Well, he allows Mance to sing. Mance comes and sings, and he doesn't seem to have a problem with that. But I don't know. So the Dreadfort was subjugated by Winterfell centuries ago after a long run as an independent power, probably the second greatest in the North overall, if we average it all out. But before the Starks came along, they could get away with whatever they wanted. But when they had to kneel to the Kings of Winter, that's when they had to start keeping it under wraps. And that's what I'm saying here. Did they actually change their behavior or just start hiding it? And I very much favor the latter, that they just started hiding it. With a few exceptions, maybe. So Roose is just trying to impart how important this knowledge is to keep things under wrap, and Ramsay is just not hearing it. He just won't do it. How to keep secrets. He's just not going to do it. It's disturbing to think about, but like, has Roose done this with like lots of other women, just like casually gone out there and be like, yep, give me that one, like, yikes. With or without children, I assume. I don't know. So we've mentioned a few times how unjust the treatment of Westerosi bastards is, like the prejudice that leads people to refer to them as creatures born of lust, and how that infects their soul because of the way they were born. Their conception somehow affects their life. Well, for once, the prejudice is right with Ramsay. It's not fair to apply that broadly, but it, a stopped clock is right twice a day, and it's right with Ramsay. Another conundrum here is really interesting. Clearly, Roose is smarter than Ramsay. That's been made apparent in a number of ways. But Roose may be restrained in ways that Ramsay isn't, because I think Roose might actually have sincere beliefs in the old gods. He technically didn't violate guest right at the Twins, because he was one of the guests too. He didn't bring murder into his host's hall because his host did that first. He just joined in. He says to Theon, "Tell me, my lord, if the kinslayer is accursed, what is a father to do when one son slays another?" He's implying that he hesitates to kill Ramsay because then he would be a kinslayer, which implies he thinks it matters. Right? Roose doesn't have many scruples, but he hesitates to do this, so it's notable. And when he mentions their plan to have Arnulf Karstark flip and turn on Stannis, he says that will happen if the gods will it. So maybe that's just religious noise. People just say things. They say expressions. But there's several examples here. And the fact that he's pragmatic and not scrupulous, yet still restrains himself in some of these matters that seem religious, it's interesting. It's worth consideration. It's interesting, too, that Ramsay helped Theon hunt Bran and company, and now he's hunting. In the beginning of this chapter, he was hunting the missing Freys. In both cases, he had no chance to succeed. In both, the Freys were already dead, and of course, the Starks were hiding in the crypts. Also ironic amongst all this, Big Walder just calls it from the beginning. He's like, "I bet those Freys are dead. That's what I would do. I'd kill them." Like, yeah, totally right. Shades of Tris Botley calling out what happened to Aeron. He's like, "Yeah, but Euron just killed him." He didn't quite kill him, but it was next best thing. And two, something Ramsay just doesn't choose to realize or can't make himself realize is how much their strength is based on appearance. Similar to how they're keeping their brutality under wraps is important, so is projecting this image of strength, which is not quite as strong as they are, and also understanding that their enemies are getting stronger. People look at the Boltons and see Freys and Lannisters helping them, and that isn't good in terms of liking them, but it is good in terms of intimidating people. And then people don't want to stand up to Bolton, Frey, Lannister all at once. That's a tall order. And but Ramsay has trouble perceiving this. We get note that Wyman brought a lot of food. This is really important. First of all, the food is crucial for the wedding, but also it's and for survival, because they're going to get snowed in. But it's like armor for Wyman, as Joe writes. He boasts his own importance. He boosts his value to the gathered lords by being the guy with food, being like, "Be nice to me. I'm the one that can, keep us all well fed." And also, he didn't bring hostages, which he surely realized the Boltons would probably want to take a hostage. So he, outmaneuvered them by not bringing any. And by bringing other stuff instead, he kind of assails their ability to critique him or to criticize him. He's like, look, I'm participating big time here. Look at all this money I'm spending. I'm part of it all. Meanwhile, Lord Stout's people are heard complaining that their stores are already taxed with winter oncoming. Like Ramsay's been eating through all their food, which is yet more groundwork for starvation in the north. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning about how Roose may understand what not to do, but he doesn't understand a lot of the things that help the Starks be so popular and so loved, which is being protectors. The Starks protect the North against winter. The Boltons are doing the opposite. They are making it worse. They are eating people's food, making their soldiers go out and fight, which, you need to eat more food when you're all active like that, getting people killed, not treating people with justice. So this is not what people are, it's not good, and it's not what they're used to. It's a significant lowering of the bar that has been in place for so long. That's a really big deal. So Roose has grasped rationally, pragmatically, what he needs to do to hold on to power, but he doesn't, his brain, because he's a brutal guy and doesn't understand compassion and the value of all that. It's like Tywin. Tywin shunned love for fear, but we see the power of love in many places can absolutely overwhelm the power of fear. Ramsay's clothing choice speaks to all this as well. He just does not understand symbolism. He's wearing wolfskins. I mean, Roose is going to paint a much different picture when they get married. He's going to be like, all the ancient enmity between Bolton and Stark can be set aside. He's like not antagonizing the Stark memory. He's showing reverence for it, even though in the back of his mind he's like, I hate the Starks. But he's saying the right words, at least decently, whereas Ramsay's just parading around in a wolfskin, like insulting that. It's working against what Roose is trying to do. So they're not working together. Like if the Boltons were together on the same page, working on the same, they would have a lot more success. But the cracks are forming because they're not united. They're not on the same page. They're working, they're contradicting each other in some spots. Ramsay more so than Roose, clearly, but yeah. So pretty big deal there. Now, why does Roose change his mind about where the wedding is? This is pretty important. It seems kind of casual, but it's very deeply strategic. Going to Winterfell is important. If they stay at Barrowton, Stannis can stay at Deepwood. There's no impetus for either of them to march, and then winter comes, and then what comes next? If winter hits, it's a big wild card, and Roose may lose his advantage. So he's smart enough to realize that if Arya marries Ramsay and they have it in Winterfell, then Stannis will lose men if he doesn't march. He has to go save Arya. It's the same maneuver we see in Slaver's Bay on a different scale. The slavers know that if they send refugees to Meereen, her compassion will be triggered and she's going to do something about it, and that will weaken her ability to handle other problems. It will increase her food burden, all this other stuff. Same thing here, again, much smaller scale. Stannis will be forced to make a move if Arya is in danger because his followers will demand it. He'll either lose support by not going, but if he goes, they can trap him. And that's why they know they can involve Arnulf Karstark, who is their cat's paw. If Stannis has an easy time of it, he may not bring Karstark's army with him. So they want to make sure it's a difficult road ahead for Stannis so that they're sure he brings his Karstark ally into the fold, who they can then have stab him in the back. As we know from the Winds of Winter chapter of Theon, Stannis, however, is very much aware of Arnulf Karstark's pending treachery, though. So I guess the gods won't will it for Roose Bolton to have that work out, because that was the thing he was hoping. He said that if the gods will it too. Now, I said there wasn't a lot of world building in this one, given the character focus, but there's definitely some. We implied some historical patterns about House Bolton, which surely qualifies. But here's something more direct from the end of the chapter. After spending most of the chapter a short distance nearby at Goldgrass, which is the name of the Stout Castle, we see this as they're arriving at Barrow Hall.
As he climbed a wide flight of wooden steps to the hall, Reek's legs began to shake. He had to stop to steady them, staring up at the grassy slopes of the Great Barrow. Some claimed it was the grave of the first king, who had led the first men to Westeros. Others argued that it must be some king of the giants who was buried there, to account for its size. A few had even been known to say it was no barrow, just a hill. But if so, it was a lonely hill, for most of the barrowlands were flat and windswept.
That really fires the imagination, right? Taking us to a time far more ancient than those alluded to by Roose with regards to old traditions. This is a topic for our coverage on Giants, unpublished as of this recording, but possibly out by the time you are hearing it or rehearing it. It's also likely a reference to the lonely mountain of Lord of the Rings fame, this lonely hill around windswept plains. Of course, George is a huge fan of Lord of the Rings, claims to read it once a year. There's a talk of a curse on this hill, like anyone who rivals the first king would wither and become corpse-like, which certainly touches on others' symbology. Too bad we don't have a copy of Maester Kennett's Passages of the Dead to refer to. Let's see. What have I missed? Yeah, so wide agreement that Roose will be killed by Ramsay. It would be interesting to hear your takes if you disagree, but we'll just wait and see. Harry Christian says, Roose is okay with Ramsay being a serial murderer as long as it doesn't affect the Bolton name, just like Tywin would have been okay with Tyrion sleeping with sex workers if he had kept it a secret. Yeah, there are an enormous number of parallels between Roose and Tywin, lesser so between Ramsay and Tyrion, but if Ramsay does kill Roose, then the number of parallels will jump a lot. It's because of the reasons and upbringing will be so similar, and that'll be something for us to explore down the line. Also, take note of the contradiction of the word bastard. Ramsay is doesn't want it aimed at him, but he doesn't actually hate the word aimed elsewhere. Like he calls his own horse a bastard in this one. So be clear on that. It's not the word that triggers him; it's just it being triggered at him or sent at him, and he doesn't like being insulted, especially by his father. So when his father calls him a bastard, that's the thing that really causes him to almost lose it. Take note, too, that Roose points out that Domeric was a great horse rider and the Lyanna, he could even outrace Lyanna. He doesn't mean that in a contemporary sense. Domeric and Lyanna were not contemporaries. So what he's saying is Lyanna was the best rider he'd ever seen until Domeric, which is most likely set up for Lyanna being a jouster, or Knight of the Laughing Tree stuff, tournament and Harrenhal relations there. It's a great line that Roose says, to hear Lord Wyman, he had become especially fond of Rhaegar Frey. in the North of Embers chapter, he just rips into Rhaegar with his wormy lips, and I hate that guy. The Milord bit, this is weird to me. Like, he explains how to say Milord like a peasant to Theon. Meanwhile, Arya says my lord back in A Clash of Kings when he's around her. So it's like, what is George doing here? Is he telling us that that Roose recognized, not that it was Arya, but he recognized her as highborn, but just didn't care? Or I just don't know what to do with this info, right? This is very confusing. I don't know why first of all, I don't know why he cares to have Theon sound like a peasant when he's calling him Lord. He's like, this is the Lord of the Iron Islands, the rightful Lord of the Iron Islands. That's how he introduces him to Barbary Dustin.
I mean, it could also, I suppose, show that Roose is more careless than we think of him as, that more things slip by him.
That's a good point, because he has the same, like, setting up Ramsay killing him. Yeah, like he just has the contempt. That's a good call. Finishing up this chapter with a joke. Jaded Redhead says, Ramsay's going to kill Roose in front of the werewood, in front of the werewood, and the werewood will be dissatisfied with the amount of blood in Roose because of all that damned leeching.
Right now, I'm just picturing the werehood.
The werehood, yeah, hit the werehood.
Straight out of
the werehood. Yeah, straight out of Compton, straight out of Old Town. Old Town is the werehood. No, not really. There's only that one werewood down there. So the real werehood is, I don't know, the Grove of Nine? Hey, we'll be going there next week. Tyrion 8. The gang meets Moqorro, aka it's always Doomy in Valyria. Of course, we love to refer to It's Always Sunny titles, and, It's Always Sunny in Valyria, Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Doomy in Valyria, how you get it. It's a chapter with enormously disparate comparisons. From what may have been the mightiest people to ever exist on this planet, the Valyrians, to Penny, about as small as they come. The fall of such a mighty power and the fallout of that loss to the world, all the different places affected by it, all the people who survived to find themselves in a completely new world, all the chaos born from that upheaval, a new world order, a vast fallen empire, this versus the struggles of a single diminutive person who has also lost everything. In the midst of it all, Tyrion, snarling. Actually, he's pretty compassionate in this one. It's definitely a reason for some optimism in Tyrion's arc. He really tries to be good to Penny here, even as she's insulting him. He just doesn't know how. And it's partly because of his upbringing. He doesn't have a lot of experience with showing compassion because he's the son of Tywin Lannister. And this is, again, an unusual pairing to think about small-scale compassion and the beginnings of a small change in a small man, or big change in a small man, and it comes along the side the first time we get close to Valyria. It's a huge moment, even though we don't get that close. Certainly not as close as Tyrion's uncle Jerian seemed to have gotten, which is referred to in this chapter as well. He was never seen again, and at the start of this one, it's been 10 years. And it's also been a little while since we've seen Penny, according to Tyrion, but not nearly 10 years. Quote,
"The Celisori Corin was 7 days from Volantis when Penny finally emerged from her cabin, creeping up on deck like some timid woodland creature emerging from a long winter's sleep."
Yeah, that's called hibernation, I guess. But it's understandable for someone in the grief that she's experienced. She's lonely. Of course she is. She's lost her family. But we're not in her head. And this isn't a character we know terribly well. Tyrion's loneliness is a little more acute because we're inside his head to think about. It's more direct. There's an evocative passage that includes all the sights he sees near land, but out at sea, there aren't even clouds. He thinks of how the sights and mysteries along the Rhoyne work quite well as distractions, and the mystery of the crew of the Asshai made that as well. Here, there's neither. His dreams are getting worse, even though they're kind of the same. Still having his father and the Shrouded Lord, Stonehands, basically the same dream recurring. And I wonder if that's ever going to slow down for him. And along with his thoughts, that's bad. Like when he has the distractions of the mysteries and the crew, that's why the dreams are getting worse, most likely. Or at least part of it. And Jorah is terrible company, worse than he was. Penny's going to warm up to Tyrion eventually, starting halfway through this chapter. But at first, as we start the chapter, she hates him. And it's emphasized as well that Tyrion is disliking sitting near groups of people at lunch and dinner who are having a good time, speaking in a language he doesn't understand, while wary of the possibility that they're laughing at him. So there's a lot of ways that George shows us how isolated and lonely he is. And we're meant to extrapolate that and say it also applies to Penny. And though maybe it's hard to feel sympathy for Jorah, it applies to him too. The one person quite happy to chat with Tyrion from the start is Moqorro. Tyrion takes note of Moqorro's friendliness. Not uncommon for priests who want to encourage you to join their religion. Lots of religious people out in the world are extremely nice, in part because they're extremely nice. Like some of them are just nice. That's just how they are. I'm not trying to be cynical about it. But also they are trying to represent their faith really well by setting a high standard to the face they show the world, right? Of course, Moqorro's literal face is actually quite scary. Pitch black with flame tattoos. Benerro was pale white with flame tattoos. So I guess they just both ends of the spectrum here. I don't know, but it's interesting and kind of intimidating. Maybe drop the kinda. Moqorro may be friendly towards Tyrion for another reason too. There's no way to know or to track which passages get quoted the most in all of A Song of Ice and Fire. I have my headcanon on which quotes in the all 5 books are referred to the most often over the years. This is definitely one of them right here.
"Dragons," Moqorro said in the common tongue of Westeros. He spoke it very well, with hardly a trace of accent. No doubt that was one reason the High Priest Benerro had chosen him to bring the faith of R'hllor to Daenerys Targaryen. Dragons, old and young, true and false, bright and dark, and you, a small man with a big shadow, snarling in the midst of it all.
So what I mean is that maybe Moqorro perceives Tyrion as an ally to Daenerys, much that Melisandre was seeing a bunch of different faces and sort of labeling them as enemies or allies. Moqorro may have already seen Tyrion in advance and recognized him. Obviously, his face is more distinct than most. And anyone a friend to Dany is a friend to him. She is, after all, according to his religion, the actual savior of the world. He flat out says that. He says, calls her the world's deliverer in this chapter. And that would also, of course, apply to his acolytes, the fiery fingers there. And the quote continues, snarling, an amiable fellow like me? Tyrion was almost flattered, and no doubt that is just what he intends. Every fool loves to hear that he's important. So that touches on of course, he just wants me to join his religion. He just wants me to feel, he wants something from me. He's not entirely wrong, right? He probably does want to convert Tyrion to R'hllor. He wouldn't be shy about saying that or anything. Tyrion is also cynical about the supernatural, though. That's a long-running example. He's increasingly wrong to be, but he hasn't flipped that switch in his head yet that, nope, lots of this magic is real. The Doom and Geryon, that's another example. Like, he's skeptical about what happened to his uncle, thinking maybe it was something more mundane. But when he actually sees Valyria, he gets chills, and he's like, whoa, look at that. It gives him a wash of thoughts, and it's the implications of such a vast thing, and thinking about the fall of Valyria. What the scope of all that. Yeah, and along the same lines of telling someone that they're important. Every fool loves to hear that he's important. That's exactly what Melisandre tells Stannis. Now, she's not intentionally lying to him, but you can see how even someone like Stannis, who is moved by that. Jon, too. She's like, Jon, you're important. Jon, you got to show power, all this stuff. So it is true that telling people they're important is a way to win trust, and it appears to be true for Tyrion, too, even though he's aware of it. Like, he likes it. He says, I'm almost flattered, or he doesn't say that. He thinks that. But beyond that quote, it's just an amazing piece of writing. Moqorro is clear and concise. There's no chance of the language being mistaken, which is really clever by George. She makes sure we know Moqorro's English, his common is tight. That's a clever angle because we've talked before about translation errors like, oh, princess that was promised. Like, little bits like that can change the meaning of a prophecy. So I think it's super clever for George to be like, no, this guy's language is strong. He knows exactly what he's saying. Aemon mentions this thing to Sam, right? For example. And secondly, it's immensely evocative, this vision. Dragons old and young? Who's the old dragon here? Aemon could still be alive at this point since Dance and Feast are parallel, but Bloodraven is, and he's a Targaryen bastard. So if it's not referring to both of them, it's definitely referring to Bloodraven. I don't think there is another one unless Melisandre really is one too. Then she's even older. That would be an interesting way to fit that into this because it was just 2 chapters ago. And then true and false. That's a huge line. I think we've got a pretty clear idea on who the false dragon is, though. We've been talking about young Griff that way the whole time. I know some of you aren't fully on board with that, but this seems to be pointing to a false dragon. And again, I would say that if Aegon's not the false dragon, then who is? Bright and dark. The inclusion of the line bright has launched a lot of, it's like the theory, the wording that launched 1,000 ships. I mean, theories and ships. Because one example being the children of Aryan Brightflame during his exile, the one who drank wildfire. He may have fathered children while he was in exile. Bright and dark is just an unusual choice of words, right? You would expect it to be light and dark. That's generally how that phrase is said, right? So we can't go fall back on translation explanations. It's not like, oh, his common's a little off. So he said bright instead of light. George cut that angle right out to make sure it was clear. Clearly unclear. Another possibility is for us to consider that bright refers to like an ice dragon, which could be a creature formed of pure ice, or a raised undead dragon with bright blue eyes. You might say, Aziz, didn't you look up every case of the word bright in the books? Isn't that normally the kind of thing you would do? Yes, I did do that. But George uses the term a lot. It's like over 300 times the word bright appears. I did browse it, and there are patterns. It's usually sunlight or moonlight, fires or metals, especially steel, or sun glinting off of steel, or moon glinting off of steel. We see a lot of steel. We see other metals too, gold, copper, brass, whatever. Scales. And that transitions us from metal to living things because scales can be scale mail, scale armor, but can also be dragon scales. And we definitely see brightness associated with dragon scales, but definitely eyes. Faces and eyes. Eyes, particularly blue eyes. I think that blue eyes are described as bright probably 3 to 4 times more than all the other eye types combined. No one ever says bright green eyes that I can recall. Like Cersei's eyes are green many times, but they're cold or they're fiery. Different descriptions. George is pretty specific with his word choices, even when he's got like 50 different words he could choose to describe the word bright. The
Lannisters are described. I mean, they have very green eyes, but it's like gold-flecked green eyes and some stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really it's not casual use of language here. And again, the other's blue eyes. It's almost always bright. When you see the White's eyes, it's really a common way for him to do that. Dark dragons. That could be literal, like Drogon. Drogon's black, right? But it could be metaphorical, meaning, again, an undead dragon or one turned to dark purposes, like ridden by a cruel person, thinking of Euron again here. Or it could mean dark like black fire. Or like Jon Snow, who dresses in black and has dark-colored hair. I mean, he is a dragon, after all, more of a wolf, but he's both. And that just scratches the surface on this quote. This is not the kind of, it's like I said, it's a bajillion, which is becoming an official number around here, quotes. I mean, examples and analyses of that particular quote are out there in the A Song of Ice and Fire fandom. I encourage you to go check some of them out, but we're not going to spend all day on it when we have so much to cover. The notion that R'hllor is coming to Dany is not new to us, but meeting the man sent to bring it to her, to bring the religion of R'hllor to Dany, that's important. No doubt Benero had other high priests he could have sent, so the fact that Moqorro is the choice, but it's got to go beyond his clear use of the common tongue. The guy survives out in the sea for 10 days or whatever. He survives being swept overboard, so he does seem like a good choice. He really proved his ability to see the whole job through. Of course, he hasn't actually gotten to Dany yet. He's with Victarion, an odd place for him to turn up, but I'm very curious to see how that goes. Moqorro says Tyrion is snarling in the midst of all these dragons, and this is delivered as Tyrion is transitioning, like arc-wise, from the Aegon Young Griff story, John Connington, to the Daenerys story. So that's really cool. He's snarling in the midst of it as he's sailing from one to the other. So that's just really good writing. Finally, it helps set the mood for passing by Valyria, right? It's itself a symbol of the death of dragons and those who rule them, as well as the enormous power they wielded for so long before the doom came to them. Along with Moqorro's visions are those of the so-called perfumed seneschal. And who should Dany fear from this? Is it a red herring? Is it Varys? It's not Resnack, I don't think. I really don't think it's the first person she thinks of. Like, that would be kind of a weird mystery. And also, I just don't see why the danger would come from him.
I just want to say that you just made me think of a quote from The Office.
Yeah?
Like, I suspected Phyllis first, which means can't be her. And I suspected that Michael last, can't be him, which means it must be the person I most middle suspect. I think the middle suspect actually was Phyllis, and I got it wrong. But regardless, who does Dany most middle suspect?
That's good. Joe says it could be Jorah. I'm kind of down on the idea that Jorah should be the one she fears from the Celisori Corrin. Just to be clear, if it's not, the Quaithe says fear the perfumed seneschal. The translation of the ship name is fragrant steward. Yes, Tyrion says stinky steward, but that he's just doing that to be funny. So I don't think it would be Jorah because Jorah is obsessed with her and wants to win her over or whatever. But Joe suggests that his obsession could become so dangerous that maybe he does do something dark or violent. Maybe he is capable of that. So I got to say Joe has a point there. I shouldn't throw that away because Quaithe does not mention Jorah otherwise. So maybe this is her way of mentioning him. Probably not, though. I do still think it's Varys. He is very fragrant. It's introduced to his character right away. The first time we meet him, he's perfumed. And Seneschal is well enough applies to him. It's not his official title, obviously, but it fits. He's a Master of Whispers, not a King's Hand or a Castellan, but it's along those lines. Someone who assists a ruler is what Moqorro says, and Master of Whispers absolutely is that. Moqorro himself, too, very serious business. I bet he's good at converting people in general. But of course, Tyrion's too cynical to believe in what Moqorro's saying at this point, even though some of it kind of pokes in his mind and argues that it's true. But he's not fully ready to accept it. He's still more of the Maester Luwin character at this point, where he downplays all the magical examples. Even he's still downplaying the possibility of the dragons, even though so many people have seen them. But you know what's going to really blow Tyrion's mind later, and going to be really hard for him to deny the power of R'hllor, is when he sees Moqorro again, assuming he does. He's going to be like, dude, you were swept overboard in the middle of the ocean, and then we drifted for weeks. How the hell did you survive? Like, he's not going to have a rational explanation. And there isn't one. Moqorro did survive because of magic. So, meanwhile, Victarion is going to turn to the Red God right away upon meeting Moqorro, basically. And it's going to be part because of that same thing. Like, that dude clearly has power. It's going to be a similar progression of proof. Like, well, that guy, he's not faking it. Moqorro's staff, it's straight from the Melisandre school of the trappings of power. I mean, it's a dragon skull that shoots green flame when he stomps it down. It's really tall. Like, that is just meant to be a little intimidating, I guess. When Moqorro mentions that others seek Daenerys, Tyrion decides against mentioning Griff and Aegon, deciding that the Red Priests would be confused and possibly unhappy to learn of a second Targaryen who may conflict with the first. Of course, there's no way to keep that secret for too long, but there's no reason for Tyrion to be the one to bring it up. Instead, Tyrion approaches the question more obliquely and says, well, who specifically have you seen in your visions then? Perhaps wondering if he'll name Griff or someone like Griff that he can kind of reason that out. Instead, though it's Victarion Greyjoy on the way to her, he doesn't name Victarion. Probably. He names the man who sent her. Have you seen these others in your fires?
No, apparently. Hold on.
You're right there.
My cursor is not where I am, and my keyboard
okay,
is low on batteries.
Have you seen these others in your fires? He asked warily. Only their shadows, Moqorro said. One most of all, a tall and twisted thing with one black eye and 10 long arms, sailing on a sea of blood. He doesn't say the name Euron, but that really can't be Victarion. Sure, Victarion's tall and twisted, sure. 10 long arms, sailing. Okay, that's Kraken stuff. That could be any Greyjoy. But one black eye? That's definitely Euron. He has one black eye and one blue eye. And the Sea of Blood bit sort of reminds us of what's being set up in the Forsaken chapter. The Battle of Blood is what the fandom seems to be calling the thing being set up there. So Moqorro doesn't see him, but does, like Quaithe does, see a bunch of these others. Which could be an indication that out of all the people Quaithe sees, the fact that Moqorro only identifies this one means that Euron is the most dangerous of them all, of Dany's foes. Which is, it's not hard to see that being true, at least in terms of humans. I mean, maybe the others are more dangerous, but anyway, Moqorro's going to learn a lot more about that. He's about to be neck deep in Kraken, healing Victarion's arm, magicking it, maybe taking him over somehow. Maybe the burned arm thing is kind of like the non-guided version of the ruby. Right? The master-slave situation. Maybe this is the analog version of that, the burned arm. Either way, he's going to be dealing with the dragon horn also. So there's lots of really cool stuff coming up. So Penny. Let's talk about Penny for a minute. She's pretty important. We talked a lot about the Doom and these visions. It's new ground for Tyrion, too. Like, we haven't gotten to know Penny that well yet, even through the end of the book. I suspect that's either coming or there's going to be some sort of tragedy. A lot of you have deep fears for Penny's future, and I'm there with you, though I'm not certain she's doomed. Someone as helpless as her, you in a sellsword company with the pale mare raging, dragons loose, it's not hard to imagine something bad happening to her. But what's interesting now is that Tyrion is basically the same social status as her now, and he's always been really high up, but now he's not. And so it's very emotional journey for her, losing everything. Same with him in a lot of ways. Different triggers for it. but they have a lot in common. They basically have been dealt a really bad hand in terms of physical form and how that the world treats them because of it. Gender for her is, she's considered the weaker gender in this world, and class way as well. She's lowborn. So all these are serious hardships to have without a support network, which she did have before. So this is the big change for her, and this is where we see some of Tyrion's compassion. They could have left her there at Volantis. Jorah wanted to, but Tyrion's like, we can't just leave her. We can't just leave her because bad things will happen to her. It's not like I have responsibility for you. I mean, maybe that's part of it. He's what's thinking, but he just can't bring himself to leave this person and let her die. He's coming around. He's divorcing what he learned from his father. That's why this is such a big deal. It seems like basic kindness, and we're like, okay, Tyrion, the bar is higher than that. But this is a son of Tywin Lannister. I think maybe he needs a little more credit, Tyrion, not Tywin, for overcoming the lessons of his father, the quote-unquote lessons, the bad parenting. He's overcoming this terrible parenting. He was taught to be contemptuous of the powerless, to make use of them, not to befriend them or to learn from them. Certainly not to see as a peer or to see as an object of sympathy. So these are emotions that Tyrion was very much taught to not have as a child by someone who was very overbearing and was hard to not listen to. You did what Tywin said or you suffered for it. So this is a pretty big growth moment for him. And he doesn't even get mad at her when she throws his wine in her face and things like that. He's just trying to put himself in her perspective. And I really appreciate that he's focusing on trying to feel what she feels. And again, because it's not something he's used to. He doesn't have this practice of compassion. He wasn't raised with compassion, so he doesn't express it to the world. And worse, it's not just his parenting. It's the whole world. He's been laughed at, looked down on, made fun of, insulted, expectations of him are lower because they think he's less capable. All these things. And a lot of the same things are true with Penny. So it's a big leap forward for him. It may not stick, but if you're one of those people that's just dead set that Tyrion is going to become an awful influence on Dany, some reason maybe to think that this isn't the case. Maybe. Some of it is also hard to figure, like how much of it is empathy, how much of it is guilt. Is it both? Does it matter? Like he's doing it. He's trying to, They start to bond after the storm. It's kind of like one of those moments where you realize you do want to live after all. We've seen this kind of thing before, especially from Tyrion. And with him falling in the water, with him drinking himself nearly to death. And I think Penny had a similar moment where the storm kind of proved to her that she really did want to live, even though things are bad right now. The mention of Braavos gets Tyrion asking if that's where Cersei hired them to perform for Joffrey, as he's obviously assumed this the entire time. But he didn't quite put together she mentions like Oswald. She doesn't remember the Kettle Black's name, but Tyrion, it doesn't trigger Tyrion's memory either. Like, oh, that was a Kettle Black, which would mean Littlefinger. Then he would know that it was Littlefinger, and he would go, I owe Peter Baelish another one. But nope. And Penny is comforted by the idea of Dany. Tyrion actually lies, although he is sort of telling the truth, that Dany is a good person to rescue her. He's just assumed all that. He's actually right. But he gives her confidence that he himself doesn't share about Daenerys, saying that she'll be good to him, or she'll be good to them. And she probably will be. In fact, she will be. We see it. Like, the slavers are about to have them killed by lions in the folly, and Dany just is like, no, they aren't willing. You broke our deal, and I won't stand for it. So she already has saved Penny before meeting her. And Tyrion. Little wordplay potentially pointed out by Nina. Tyrion is amused by thinking of the translation of the word Koran as being akin to king's hand, which, he might end up being queen's hand for Daenerys, and that might be a little tidbit of foreshadowing there. A little more on the Doom briefly here. The idea of 14 volcanoes simultaneously erupting is like, wow, no wonder it's called the Doom, huh? That's part of why there's lots of theories about magic being involved. And of course, the Fire and Blood expands on things like what's going on there now. Balerion went to Valyria and got that horrific wound from something, and Princess Aerea, who was riding him, came back with things inside her. So Tyrion's probably more right than he knows in saying the Valyrians reaped what they sowed in terms of their own destruction, because it does seem like sort of a large-scale karmic cycle with all the people they were abusing finally got back on them. That's something that we cover in our episode on the Doom of Valyria. So I highly recommend that if you are interested in more. All right, a few questions. Dornish James is not entirely sure how, but Moqorro knowing both Tyrion and Victarion may be important for getting them to work together in the Winds of Winter. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I've entertained that notion that Victarion, through control, through like Relorist control, his arm might be like Moqorro may be able to control him. That would end up him being like actually fighting on Dany's side, maybe not willingly, but you know, if we're looking for an alternative to Victarion just simply dying, which it definitely could go that way. But if that's not the way it goes, then yeah, maybe Moqorro's just like, why get rid of this stupid Ironborn captain when we could turn him to our side? Maybe that's how he's thinking about it. He's like, we could get this guy on our team. Just stick him in the front line with the soldiers. Don't give him a job leading, but hey, he can fight. That's for sure. If he's fighting for our team, then yeah, bring it. So it's possible. Jonathan Hagee says, I wonder if red priests went on pilgrimage to Westeros to see dragons. Oh, interesting idea. Yeah, like when during Aegon's time, obviously there were no dragons that we know of in Essos, but they would certainly be hanging out on Dragonstone and at the Dragon Pit and things like that. So that's a good call, Jonathan Hagee. Yeah, you would see seeing fire made flesh would be something maybe pseudo religious or just spectacular. And of course we know that they tried to convert a couple of different Targaryen kings, like Aerys in particular, Robert as well. Didn't really work, but maybe it would have if they had had some real magic to show off. Tree Girl points to the phrase perfumed seneschal for Varys as a mirror to rotting sea cow for Illyrio. That's pretty cool. Yeah, they do have that's a similar stinky, good smelling seneschal, bad smelling sea cow. As if we needed more cannibalism references, Tyrion casually mentions the singer's stew here, which is an appetizer for Frey pies, which is 4 chapters from now, and for Jojen paste, which, if true, is the actual next chapter in this book. Here's another quote. No, he said a dozen times, the dragonflies, not the elephants. That comes when he's trying to teach Penny Syvass. And this kind of goes back to our old wordplay with elephants for the Volantines, dragons for the Valyrians. The elephants are a poor copy of that, but it's the closest they can get. And yeah, it's like trying to make an elephant into something that it isn't by saying the dragonflies, not the elephants. Well, Dumbo. Haven't they ever heard of Dumbo? Dumbo flies. He doesn't breathe fire, though. So there's the book, The Life of Triarch Bilicho, a famous Volantine patriot whose unbroken succession of conquests and triumphs ended rather abruptly when he was eaten by giants. That is a football reference. Triarch Bilicho refers to Bill Belichick, the Volantine patriot, it says. He's the coach of the New England Patriots. And there was a season, I don't remember what year it was, like 6-8 years ago, I don't know. No, it had to be more than that because it was before Dance with Dragons. It had to be before 2011. When the Patriots had a completely undefeated season where they made it to the Super Bowl. They didn't lose a single game in the playoffs or the regular season, but then they lost in the finals to the Giants, so which is George's favorite team. So that was obviously a great moment for George that he'll probably never forget. His favorite team beating the unbeaten Patriots. There are more references to the New York Giants later in the book. I'll spoil one of them right now. 1-1 is a number is 1-1. The number 1 twice. Number 11 is Giants quarterback Phil Simms. But even that doesn't end it. So more to come on the giant Easter eggs. Giants Easter eggs. They're not actually that large. So that's pretty cool. Apparently, this anecdote is in the iBook edition. Our regular commenter, Archmaester Rennie, who is reading the books on the iBooks edition, occasionally tells us something like this. I knew this anecdote already, but I didn't know that it appears in the iBooks, which is pretty cool that that got included as just a little fun trivia bit. Okay, bit of a quirk today. Each chapter was longer than the one before it. I'm not sure that's ever happened before. All 4 in a row were progressively longer. But as you can see, we didn't actually spend equal amount of time. Melisandre, unsurprisingly, was the longest one that we spent time on. But technically, it was shorter than 2 of the other chapters today. Last week we covered 134 minutes, 44 seconds. This week, 162:35, so a good bit more, and the episode is a bit longer, so that makes sense. We have covered 1,348 minutes of 2,922, putting us at 46.2% of the book, so next week we will cross the halfway point. As always, you can compare the video length to the podcast final version, get a sense of how much gets edited out, little things like tripping over my tongue or little spaces here and there or mispronunciations, things like that. Occasionally I cut a whole take out if I don't like how it sounds when I'm listening to it. Or if I'm repetitive, which definitely happens sometimes. So don't forget to like the video or leave a review or a rating on iTunes or Podbean or Stitcher or wherever you listen. I keep saying Stitcher, and I don't know that we're on Stitcher, but we're on Spotify and pretty much everything else. Stitcher might be the only thing we're not on, but we may have been added to their catalog without me even realizing it. The podcast world is still a bit of a Wild West situation because it's basically not even a 20-year-old industry. Anyway, as usual, I will mention the episodes that are scripted that expand on many of the topics here in this episode. The Doom of Valyria, of course. Asshai is a big one. That one, not just Melisandre, but figuring out what happened there so long ago. The Hellhorn, we mentioned. That's the episode we did all on Dragonbinder. I didn't specifically mention it during the text, but Joanna Lannister deserves mention here because we talk so much about parentage. And we focus on Tywin because Tyrion never met his mother. But you wonder what kind of person she was, and she certainly had an impact on Cersei and Jaime, and obviously on Tywin himself. So we got almost a 2-hour episode all about her. We also, of course, have episodes on the Battle of Fire and the Battle of Ice. Battle of Fire is the situation in Marine. That's another name for it, is the Battle of Marine. Battle of Ice, heavily foreshadowed by the events today, coming Stannis versus the Boltons, the phrase, possibly a pit trap of ice into a lake, things like that. 3-part series is the Battle of Ice. It's much longer than the Battle of Fire. We have Brendan Beefish of Nauticast and Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire blog fame, as well as being a Reddit mod. He was with us for all 3 of those episodes, and it was his first ever appearance on a podcast. So that's pretty cool too. So a little bit of a Song of Ice and Fire community trivia for you. Next time, 4 more chapters, 4 more big ones, really monumental chapters. It's like the halfway point of the book is filled with like things that you might find at the end of a more normal book. But, you know, A Song of Ice and Fire is just on another level of excellence. Bran 3, the one with Winterfell werewood visions, a.k.a. that might be Jojen paste.
John 7, Return to the Grove of Nine, a.k.a. the gang meets 1-1.
Daenerys 6, A Cloak of 1,000 Flies, a.k.a. a Tokar of 1,000 Lies.
And the Prince of Winterfell, False Vows Before a Heart Tree, a.k.a. the one with Frey pies.
Yeah, we got Bran's last chapter, we got the Frey pies chapter. Man, we got Jojen paste, we got Bran's visions. Grove of Nine, it's a big one. Lots of religion, lots of heart trees. It's going to be good. Thanks to Asshai for doing so much all at once. Really had to sit there a long time today. Joe and Nina, thanks very much for all the assistance covering all these chapters. Whew, there's no way we would have been able to cover so much without their help. There's just way too much to consider. Thanks to our History of Westeros mods. Same deal, y'all, by posting every chapter individually with great artwork, leading the discussions. More fun things come out of that, and more ideas make their way into each episode. Same goes for those of y'all who participate over on Flick, over on Facebook. Well, I said Facebook already. Slack and Discord as well. I've been spending a lot more time on our Slack and Discord channels. Why is that? Because I deleted Twitter and Facebook from my phone, and it's just been giving me a lot more emotional energy to talk to people and a lot more time, more importantly, more directly. And it's been great. You know, I still get on Facebook and Twitter on my desktop, but not on my phone. It's been great. Really liking it. Claridox, thank you, Michael Klarfeld, for your excellent maps and video intro, and for finding Kevin McLeod for us, who gave us the Valar Rereadis music. Thanks to Joey Townsend, Jesse Koval for our regular recurring music intro and outro. Thanks to the Bengineer for his engineering of our sound, making it sound balanced and good and even. Thank you to our patrons for keeping our show going. We've had a nice response to our last episode. It's very heartwarming that many of you are choosing to support us, especially this time of year around Christmas when people have lots of money to spend on various things. So I'm super, super enthused and encouraged and motivated to keep this all going and to keep the episodes rolling with the same verve and vigor that we always attempt. So thank you very much for any form of support you've given. And as always, we like to recommend checking out Here Be Dragons. Unfortunately, we kind of bled into their stream a little today. It's a little past. They've already started, but it's Steven's birthday, so it should be pretty festive atmosphere over there. Our good friend Steven Stark, longtime supporter, really doing good work over there, getting his own channel going. So go say hi. At least wish him a happy name day, even if you don't have time to hang out for the duration. And until next week, everybody, Valar Rereadis.